Hey everyone, and welcome back to History Simplified. Today, we're talking about that time when Sweden, a country we now associate with sensible furniture and excellent pop music, completely lost its mind and decided to solve a succession crisis by hiring a French general. Not just any general, mind you, but one of Napoleon Bonaparte's superstar marshals. Think of it as the world's most chaotic corporate headhunting mission, where your failing company tries to poach the star vice president from the mega corporation that is actively trying to crush you. The logic was creative. This whole saga is a masterclass in desperation, political maneuvering, and rebranding so successful it feels like a cosmic joke. Now, before the inevitable betrayals and diplomatic backstabbing begin, if you enjoy this highly inaccurate but fun version of history, please hit that like and subscribe button. Seriously, it helps us buy more silly hats for the next video. Alright, grab some popcorn. Things are about to get unnecessarily complicated. Our story begins in the early 1800s, a period when Europe was less a collection of stable countries and more a continent-wide bar fight instigated by one short, very ambitious Frenchman. Napoleon Bonaparte was redrawing maps with cannons, and if you weren't with him, you were probably about to be against him, whether you liked it or not. In this chaotic landscape, Sweden was having a particularly bad time. A very, very bad time. For centuries, Sweden had been a certified European heavyweight, the Lion of the North. They had an empire, a fearsome military reputation, and a whole lot of snow. But by the dawn of the 19th century, that empire was looking a little frayed, a little rusty. The lion was looking more like a grumpy, slightly mangy cat. The man in charge of this fading glory was King Gustav IV Adolf. Gustav was, let's be charitable and say he was a man of conviction. Less charitably, he was a stubborn, politically tone-deaf ruler whose single most defining personality trait was a burning, all-consuming hatred for Napoleon. He saw Bonaparte not just as a geopolitical rival, but as the literal antichrist, the beast of the apocalypse. This wasn't just policy, this was personal. This obsession led him to glue Sweden's foreign policy to Great Britain and, by extension, to every coalition against France. A bold strategy, cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him. Spoiler, it did not. This brings us to the Finnish War of 1808-1809. Napoleon, in a brief moment of being buddies with Tsar Alexander I of Russia, decided to punish Sweden for being so annoyingly pro-British. The plan was simple. Russia would invade Sweden and force it into Napoleon's continental system. A massive trade embargo against Britain. The target for this invasion was Finland. Now, it's hard to overstate how important Finland was to Sweden. It wasn't a colony. It had been an integral part of the Swedish kingdom for over 600 years. It was the eastern half of the country, providing vital resources, manpower, and a strategic buffer against the enormous Russian bear next door. Losing Finland would be like the United States losing everything east of the Mississippi. It was unthinkable. So, of course, it happened. The war was an absolute, unmitigated catastrophe. The Swedish military, once the terror of Europe, was poorly led, badly supplied, and completely unprepared. The Russians rolled over the border and just kept going. The whole campaign was a masterclass in how to lose a defensive war. Fortresses surrendered without a fight. Armies were outmaneuvered and captured. The Swedish government was in a state of paralyzed denial, while the king issued increasingly detached and unhelpful orders from his palace in Stockholm. Within a year, it was all over. The Treaty of Frederikshamn was signed, and just like that, 6 centuries of shared history were erased. Finland was gone, absorbed into the Russian Empire as an autonomous Grand Duchy. This was Sweden's rock bottom. The national psyche was shattered. They hadn't just lost a war. They'd lost a core piece of their identity. The country was humiliated, broken, and bankrupt. And who do you blame when your country spontaneously combusts? You blame the guy holding the matches. All eyes turned to King Gustav IV Adolf. His obsessive, single-minded crusade against Napoleon had led them directly into this national train wreck. The Swedish elite, from military officers to civil servants, decided they'd had enough of his apocalyptic foreign policy. This wasn't just mismanagement. This was existential failure. So, they did what any rational, disgruntled aristocracy does when their king flies the country straight into a mountain. They launched a coup. In March 1809, a group of nobles and officers marched into the royal palace, informed the king he was fired, and placed him under arrest. There was no bloodshed, no dramatic battle in the throne room. It was a shockingly quiet, depressingly efficient bit of treason. And this kicked off our first major cause and effect chain. The whole thing was a brutal, logical progression. Cause, King Gustav IV Adolf's rigid and disastrous foreign policy drags an unprepared Sweden into a war with a vastly superior Russia. Effect: Sweden suffers a catastrophic defeat, resulting in the permanent loss of Finland, a territory that constituted over a third of the kingdom's land area and a quarter of its population. Consequence: the military and political establishment, seeing the king as an active threat to the nation's survival, stage a bloodless coup, forcing him to abdicate and sending him and his family into exile. The result: a massive, gaping power vacuum at the absolute worst possible moment. This is the part of the story where you have to appreciate the sheer, pants-wetting terror of the Swedish government. Firing your king is the ultimate panic button. It's the political equivalent of realizing you're about to fail an exam, so you pull the fire alarm to evacuate the entire school. Sure, you avoided the test for now, but you've created a much bigger, much more complicated problem. The kingdom was broken, the throne was empty, and the great powers of Europe were circling like vultures. Sweden didn't just need a new plan, it needed a miracle. And that desperation would lead them to make one of the strangest, most audacious hiring decisions in modern history. They had to find a new king, and they had to do it fast. So, you've just fired your king. Congratulations! The good news is the guy whose incompetence lost you a third of your country is now locked out of the company's Slack channel. The bad news is you have no CEO, your stock is in the toilet, and your biggest competitor, the one who just stole your entire R&D department, is staring at you from across the street, tapping a baseball bat into his palm. The Swedish Riksdag, their parliament, needed a replacement monarch, and they needed one yesterday. But you can't just appoint a new king like you're hiring a shift manager. You need legitimacy. You need someone with royal blood, someone who won't make the other monarchies in Europe clutch their pearls and declare war on you for being too revolutionary. Their solution was the definition of a stopgap measure. They went to the deposed king's uncle, Duke Charles, and said, "Tag, you're it." He was crowned King Charles XIII. On paper, this made sense. He was family. He was available. He ticked is technically a royal box. But in reality, Charles XIII was the human equivalent of a sorry for the inconvenience sign. He was 60 years old, which in the early 19th century was basically ancient. He was in perpetually poor health, chronically exhausted, and had zero interest in the tedious business of actually running a country. Most importantly, Charles XIII was completely, utterly childless. He was the end of the line. Placing him on the throne didn't solve the succession crisis, it just put it on a timer. The coup plotters had essentially swapped out a terrible long-term king for a benign, but temporary one. They had bought themselves a little time, but now the question of who comes next became the single most important issue in Swedish politics. This wasn't a domestic debate club question. It was a geopolitical thunderdome. The search for an heir became a high-stakes game show. Let's call it Europe's next top monarch, and all the major powers wanted to rig the outcome. In one corner, you had Russia. Tsar Alexander I, fresh from conquering Finland, was watching Sweden with the smug satisfaction of a cat watching a wounded mouse. He didn't want a new Swedish leader who was a hot-headed revanchist bent on reclaiming lost territory. He wanted someone quiet, predictable, and preferably a little bit scared of him. A friendly, compliant Sweden was the goal. In another corner was Denmark. Sweden's oldest and most bitter rival, King Frederick VI, saw this as the opportunity of a lifetime. A power vacuum in Stockholm. A chance to put a Danish prince on the Swedish throne and resurrect the old Kalmar Union that had once bound Scandinavia together under a single crown. Yes, please, this was the Danish geopolitical Super Bowl, and looming over everyone, of course, was Napoleon. The Emperor of the French was the final boss of European politics. His approval mattered. Any candidate he supported would gain immense prestige. Any candidate he rejected would be politically radioactive. Napoleon, for his part, just wanted a Sweden that would play ball, obey his continental system, and stop being best friends with Great Britain. He was the show's executive producer, with full veto power. Caught in the middle of this three-way tug of war, the Swedish government made what seemed like a sensible first move. They decided to formally adopt an heir for their childless king. They chose a Danish prince, Christian August of Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Augustenburg. Let's just call him Charles August, because nobody has time for that. He was the younger brother of the Duke who was next in line for the Danish throne. This choice was a strategic masterstroke, or so it seemed. He was a respected soldier. He wasn't the direct heir to Denmark, which calmed some anti-Danish fears. And his adoption was a clear signal to Russia that Sweden was looking to build a stronger Scandinavian bloc as a counterweight. It was a clever play. So, in early 1810, Charles August was officially elected Crown Prince of Sweden, packed his bags, and moved to Stockholm. Problem solved. Crisis averted. Everyone exhaled for about 5 minutes. In May 1810, just a few months after his arrival, Crown Prince Charles August was attending a military review in Scania. As he sat on his horse, watching the soldiers drill, he suddenly swayed, slumped forward, and fell to the ground, dead. The official cause was apoplexy, a stroke, a tragic, unlucky but perfectly natural death. Nobody believed that, not for a second. The Swedish public, already on edge and steeped in a century's worth of political paranoia, immediately screamed poison. This couldn't be a coincidence. Their brand new, shiny savior prince doesn't just die of natural causes, he must have been assassinated. And who would do such a thing? The finger of blame pointed squarely at the Gustavians, the old guard nobles who were still loyal to the exiled King Gustav IV. They must have killed the new heir to create chaos and bring their man back to the throne. The prime suspects were the powerful and aristocratic Fersen family. The situation spiraled into madness, leading to our next chain of events. Cause: with an elderly, heirless king on the throne, Sweden selects a Danish prince as crown prince to secure the future. Effect: the chosen heir, Charles August, dies suddenly and suspiciously just months after his arrival, triggering a wave of public paranoia and conspiracy theories about assassination. Consequence: this paranoia explodes into a full-blown political riot in Stockholm, where a frenzied mob, believing him responsible for the prince's death, brutally lynches the elderly Count Axel von Fersen in broad daylight, plunging the capital into anarchy. This is the point where Sweden's national project went from a dumpster fire to a Chernobyl-level event. They had tried to solve their problem rationally. They made a safe, strategic choice, and the universe responded by striking their chosen heir dead and turning their capital city into a scene of horrifying mob justice. They were now back at square one, needing an heir, but the stakes were infinitely higher. The country was not just politically unstable, it was actively tearing itself apart. The government was terrified, the public was hysterical, and the need for a new crown prince had gone from urgent to apocalyptically critical. They needed someone who could not only inherit a throne but also stare down Russia, manage Napoleon, and calm a nation that had just murdered a nobleman in the street. Their next choice couldn't be sensible or safe. It had to be radical. It had to be desperate. The city of Stockholm was a powder keg with a lit fuse. The corpse of a high-ranking nobleman, lynched by a mob in broad daylight, was a pretty clear indicator that the social contract had been cancelled due to bad weather. The government was in full-blown panic mode. Their neat, tidy solution to the succession crisis had not only died on a horse, but had also triggered a homicidal citywide riot. The interim king, Charles XIII, was old, frail, and about as capable of controlling the situation as a decorative teapot. Sweden was officially off the rails. It was leaderless, heirless, paranoid, and broke. The national mood was a cocktail of despair and rage, and the rest of Europe was watching, waiting for the final, messy collapse. It is in moments of complete and utter failure that you sometimes get a flash of brutal clarity. The Swedish Riksdag, and more specifically its powerful secret committee that handled foreign policy, had one of these flashes. Their first attempt at finding an heir had been based on the old rules of monarchy. Find a guy with a decent bloodline, a respectable title, and the right political connections. They had picked Prince Charles August because he checked all the traditional boxes, and the result was chaos. It was now painfully obvious that Sweden's problems were far too severe for a traditional solution. The house wasn't just messy, the foundations were cracked and the roof was on fire. They didn't need a new tenant, they needed a structural engineer, a firefighter, and a security guard all rolled into one. The job description for the next crown prince was rewritten from scratch. This wasn't a casting call for a prince anymore. This was a desperate headhunting mission for a national savior. The old checklist was shredded. Related to a king, who cares, nice guy, irrelevant, knows how to wave from a balcony, not a priority. The new list of qualifications was short, ruthless, and entirely a product of the Napoleonic age. First, and most importantly, military genius, non-negotiable. Sweden was a wounded animal surrounded by predators. They needed a leader who projected so much raw military power that Russia would think twice about trying to grab another piece of the country. They needed a celebrated general, a battlefield commander whose reputation alone was a strategic asset. The next king of Sweden had to be, first and foremost, a warrior, second, political cunning. This wasn't a job for a simple soldier. Europe was a chessboard being played by masters like Napoleon, Tsar Alexander, and the British cabinet. The new heir had to be able to sit at that table and not get eaten alive. He needed to be a skilled negotiator, a strategist who could balance impossible alliances and navigate the brutal realities of the Napoleonic world. Third, independent resources. Sweden was hemorrhaging money. The treasury was empty. The last thing they could afford was another broke prince they had to prop up with state funds. They needed someone who was already established, someone with their own wealth, their own network, their own power base. A candidate who brought resources to the table instead of taking them away would be a game changer. And finally, the most dangerous and delicate requirement, a connection to Napoleon. This was the ultimate double-edged sword. While many Swedes loathed the French emperor, they couldn't deny his power. He was the center of their universe. A new leader who was a total stranger to Napoleon would have no influence, but someone Napoleon knew, respected, and maybe even had a complex relationship with. That person could negotiate. That person could get a direct line to the man who ran the continent. They needed an insider, or at least someone who looked like one. With this new, terrifyingly ambitious job description in hand, the old list of candidates was incinerated. What about the brother of the dead prince? Another Dane, not enough star power. He was a lateral move when they needed a quantum leap. What about the son of the king they just kicked out? Bringing back the Gustavian line would almost certainly trigger a civil war. No, the old royal houses of Europe couldn't provide what they needed. The gene pool of German princelings and Scandinavian nobles was filled with placeholders, not turnaround CEOs. This radical shift in thinking became a pivotal cause and effect chain. Cause, the catastrophic failure of their first choice for heir, demonstrated that Sweden's crisis was too profound for a traditional monarchical solution. Effect, the Swedish government, driven by desperation, abandoned the prerequisite of royal blood and rewrote the job description to prioritize military prowess, political skill, and a connection to Napoleon. Consequence, this pivot dramatically expanded the pool of candidates to include the most unconventional group imaginable, Napoleon's own marshals, the most feared and respected military commanders in the world. The search for a king was no longer a diplomatic affair. It was a recruitment drive in enemy territory. You really have to pause and admire the sheer, magnificent audacity of this move. This is a centuries-old kingdom, an institution built on the sacred bedrock of heredity and divine right. And they just decided to chuck all of that into a volcano. Their new policy was essentially, forget bloodlines, let's go hire the baddest dude we can find. It was the 19th century equivalent of a stuffy, old money corporation on the brink of bankruptcy deciding to hire a maverick tech bro from a rival company as their new CEO. They were about to go shopping for a king in the one place no one would ever expect. The senior leadership team of their continent's unhinged, all-conquering emperor. The search was on. So, the Swedish government had its come-to-Jesus moment. They realized their country was a failing state, and the only way to save it was to hire a military demigod. Tradition be damned. They were ready to go shopping for a king in Napoleon's inner circle, a bold, decisive, and frankly terrifying plan. But before they could send a recruitment team to Paris with a sack full of cash and a crown, something incredibly predictable happened. Bureaucracy, the sheer, radical brilliance of the let's hire a French general plan was so overwhelming that the old, cautious, institutional part of the government immediately had a panic attack and tried to slam on the brakes. Change is scary. Hiring a battle-hardened French marshal who probably didn't speak a word of Swedish and was a product of the godless French Revolution was really scary. King Charles XIII and his closest ministers, the ones who had to actually sign off on this madness, got cold feet. Their thinking was brutally simple. The last plan, the Danish prince plan, didn't fail because it was a bad idea. It failed because the prince had the spectacular bad luck to die of a stroke. The strategy was sound, so why reinvent the wheel? Let's just get another Danish prince. Suddenly, a new frontrunner emerged, and he was the most obvious, most boring, and safest choice imaginable. Prince Frederick Christian of Augustenburg. He was, conveniently, the older brother of the recently deceased and much lamented Charles August. The sales pitch wrote itself. This wasn't a radical new direction, it was continuity. It was honoring the memory of their fallen hero. It was what Charles August would have wanted. A powerful faction in the Swedish court, who still dreamed of a grand Scandinavian union that balanced out Russia's power, threw all their weight behind this choice. To them, this was the only sane move on the board. They had a chance to unite with Denmark, their historic rival, creating a formidable northern power bloc. Why throw that away for some French wild card? This candidate, let's call him Denmark 2.0, became the establishment's choice. He was a known quantity. He was a proper prince from a proper royal house. He wouldn't show up with a weird accent and a tattoo that said "Death to Kings," a detail that will become ironically relevant later. But for a growing number of Swedes, particularly younger, more nationalistic officers in the army, this plan was not safe. It was a complete and total surrender. They had just fought tooth and nail to maintain their independence from the great powers, losing Finland in the process, and now the government's brilliant idea was to voluntarily merge with their oldest enemy, Denmark. To them, a Danish king on the Swedish throne was tantamount to becoming a Danish province. Stockholm would become a backwater, second to Copenhagen. It was a national humiliation. The political scene in Stockholm became fiercely divided. On one side, you had the cautious traditionalists, the pro-Danish aristocrats, and the old king himself, all pushing for Prince Frederick. On the other, you had the patriotic Swedish party, a loose coalition of military men and nobles who would rather see a devil on the throne than a Dane. The King of Denmark, Frederick VI, wasn't helping matters. He was lobbying aggressively, seeing a historic opportunity to bring Sweden under his influence. It was less a polite diplomatic inquiry and more a full court press, promising all sorts of benefits if Sweden would just make the right choice. This internal political war created our next critical chain reaction, cause the powerful Swedish establishment, recoiling from the terrifyingly radical idea of hiring a Napoleonic Marshal, defaults to what it perceives as the safest option available. Effect, they champion the candidacy of Prince Frederick Christian, the brother of the previous heir, effectively running the Danish alliance strategy that had just ended in disaster. Consequence, this safe choice provokes a furious backlash from nationalist factions, who view a Danish king as a betrayal of Swedish sovereignty. The government becomes deadlocked, unable to move forward, creating a frustrating power vacuum where no decision is the worst decision of all. This is the glorious, infuriating nature of institutional inertia after a crisis of biblical proportions. After acknowledging the need for a paradigm-shifting solution, the committee's final recommendation is to do the same thing they did last time, but cross their fingers a little harder. It's like a Hollywood studio whose big summer blockbuster bombed spectacularly. So to recoup the losses, they immediately greenlight a sequel with the dead protagonist's brother. It's a failure of imagination, a triumph of political cowardice. The Swedish government was stuck. The Riksdag was about to meet to elect a new heir, and the dominant, official candidate was one that a huge portion of the military and political class found completely unacceptable. They were grinding to a halt, paralyzed by their own caution. But this kind of frustrating, soul-crushing deadlock is precisely the environment where mavericks and rule-breakers thrive. While the old men in Stockholm were endlessly debating the pros and cons of another Danish prince, a few impatient Swedes decided that official channels were broken. If the government couldn't or wouldn't find the savior Sweden needed, then maybe someone else would have to do it for them. Someone was about to go off script. When governments become deadlocked, when committees are paralyzed by indecision, and when the fate of a nation hangs in the balance, history is often hijacked by a single, impatient individual who decides they've had enough, while the Swedish Riksdag was stuck in an endless loop debating the merits of Denmark to .0. A man who was not a king, not a minister, and not even a particularly high-ranking general decided that diplomacy was a spectator sport for cowards. It was time for some chaos. Enter Baron Karl Otto Murner. Let's be very clear about who this guy is. He is not a major player. He is a 29-year-old lieutenant in the Upland Infantry Regiment, in the grand, powdered wig hierarchy of Swedish society. He was a minor nobleman with a middling rank. He was middle management. He was the guy you send to fix the printer, not the guy you send to renegotiate the company's entire corporate structure. But Murner was also a fervent patriot. He was a card-carrying member of the anti-Danish faction, and he watched with mounting horror as his country's leaders prepared to steer the ship of state directly into a Danish iceberg. He believed, with every fiber of his being, in the radical, terrifying idea that only a French marshal could save Sweden, and he was sick of waiting for the old men in Stockholm to grow a spine. As fate would have it, Murner was about to be sent on a trip. The army needed new equipment, and many soldiers were in desperate need of modern prosthetics after the disastrous Finnish War. Murner was given the deeply unglamorous task of traveling to Paris to handle the procurement, a government shopping trip. His secondary, and slightly more important, task was to act as a courier. He was to deliver dispatches to the official Swedish envoy in Paris, Baron Lagerbielke. These dispatches contained the Swedish government's official position. They were strongly leaning towards the Danish prince, and Lagerbielke's job was to gently prod Napoleon's government to see if the emperor would give his blessing. So, to recap Murner's mission profile: buy some gear, drop off a letter, He was a glorified FedEx driver with a shopping list. He possessed exactly zero diplomatic authority. He was explicitly forbidden from negotiating, discussing, or even hinting at any policy. He was a messenger boy, and that's it. But before he even packed his bags, Murner and a small cabal of like-minded junior officers held a secret meeting. They were the young, frustrated generation, the ones who had actually fought in the Finnish War and knew how desperate the situation was. They saw the government in action as a death sentence, and they saw Murner's boring little trip to Paris as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The plan they hatched was simple, direct, and completely insane. It was, in modern terms, a rogue operation. Murner would go to Paris. He would deliver his boring dispatches to the official envoy to maintain his cover, and then he would go find a French marshal and offer him the Swedish crown. Let that sink in. A lieutenant on a mission to buy medical supplies was going to unilaterally offer the throne of his country to a foreign general, completely bypassing his own government, his own ambassador, and every rule of diplomatic protocol ever written. This wasn't just insubordination. This was a breathtaking act of political sabotage, bordering on treason. If he was caught, his career would be over. He'd be lucky to get away with just being thrown in prison. This audacious decision created a pivotal chain of events driven by one man's frustration. Karl Otto Murner, a passionate but low-ranking officer, is convinced that his government's indecisive drift towards a Danish heir will be the ruin of Sweden. Effect, when he is given a mundane courier and procurement mission to Paris, he and his co-conspirators secretly decide to use it as a cover for a wildly unauthorized diplomatic gambit. Consequence, Murner transforms his official shopping trip into a clandestine headhunting mission, preparing to bypass all official channels and offer the Swedish crown directly to one of Napoleon's marshals, risking his career and freedom on a single, desperate roll of the dice. This is history at its most beautifully unhinged. This isn't a story about the grand, sweeping forces of economics and destiny. It's a story about a random guy who looked at a situation and said, "You know what? Everyone in charge is an idiot. I'll do it myself." It's the ultimate case of asking for forgiveness, not permission, on a national scale. Murner was not a hero, not yet. He was an insubordinate loose cannon about to stick a pry bar into the delicate clockwork of European diplomacy just to see what would happen. You have to respect the sheer, magnificent nerve. So, in the summer of 1810, Lieutenant Murner arrived in Paris, the glittering, dangerous capital of the Napoleonic Empire. He had his shopping list in one pocket and a stolen kingdom to give away in the other. It was time to find a candidate. Paris in 1810 was the undisputed center of the world. It was the capital of a continent-spanning empire, a city crackling with power, ambition, and the jangling spurs of Napoleon's elite. For a junior officer from a backwater kingdom like Sweden, it must have been intoxicating and terrifying. Karl Otto Murner wasn't there to see the sights. He was there to go shopping, but his shopping list didn't include wine or silk. It included a king. He was effectively running a one-man fantasy football draft of French marshals, and he needed to make the perfect pick. The talent pool was dazzling. Napoleon had created 26 marshals of the empire, a brotherhood of the most successful and ruthless military commanders of the age. But who to choose? Murner couldn't just walk up to the first one he saw and make an offer. He needed the right one, someone who fit the impossible job description Sweden's crisis demanded. His process of elimination was a masterclass in pragmatic desperation. First, you cross off the Bonaparte family loyalists. A prime candidate on paper was Eugene de Beauharnais, Napoleon's stepson. He was royalty adjacent, a capable administrator as Viceroy of Italy, and generally well regarded. The Swedish government had even briefly considered him, but for Murner, he was a non-starter. He was too much a part of the imperial machine. Choosing Eugene would be like handing Sweden's keys directly to Napoleon. It would make Sweden a subsidiary, not a sovereign nation. Murner needed a CEO, not a branch manager. So, Eugene was out. Then there was Joachim Murat, King of Naples and Napoleon's brother-in-law. All flash and courage, Murat was a rock-star cavalry commander, but he was also famously vain, politically inept, and already had his own kingdom to play with. More importantly, he was family. He was another puppet on a Bonaparte string. Out. What about the hardcore, dyed-in-the-wool professionals? The guys whose loyalty to the emperor was absolute. Take Marshal Divout, the Iron Marshal, arguably Napoleon's most brilliant subordinate. A tactical genius and a ruthlessly efficient administrator. A powerhouse candidate, but Divout's loyalty to Napoleon was legendary. He was the ultimate company man. He would never, ever betray the emperor. Trying to recruit him would be pointless, and probably get Murner arrested. The same went for many of the others. They were Napoleon's men. First and last, they lacked the required independence. Murner's search forced him to look for a very specific, almost paradoxical profile, a man with all the prestige of a Napoleonic Marshal, but without the inconvenient loyalty that usually came with it. He needed a disgruntled superstar, and as he sifted through the possibilities, one name kept rising to the top: Jean-Baptiste Jules Bernadotte, Prince of Pontecorvo. On the surface, Bernadotte was just another name on a long list of accomplished generals. But as Murner looked closer, he saw the perfect candidate. First, the military bona fides were impeccable. Bernadotte was one of the original marshals appointed in 1804. He had been a hero of the Revolutionary Wars, a fierce commander who knew how to lead from the front. He commanded immense respect within the French army and across Europe. Military genius? Check. Second, he had administrative experience. Napoleon had made him the sovereign prince of Pontecorvo, a tiny Italian principality. It wasn't much, but it meant Bernadotte had experience with governance. He knew how to be more than just a general. Check. Third, he was rich. Bernadotte had amassed a considerable personal fortune, and his wife, Desiree Clary, came from a wealthy merchant family. He could finance himself. Sweden wouldn't be on the hook for his expenses. A huge plus. Check. Then came the kicker, the detail that made him stand out from all the rest. A few years prior, during a campaign against Prussia, Bernadotte's corps had occupied Swedish Pomerania as military governor. He had treated the Swedish soldiers he'd captured and the local officials with shocking decency. He was polite, fair, and professional in an age of brutal occupation. This simple act of kindness had made him a minor celebrity back in Sweden. He was remembered as the good French marshal. It was a massive PR advantage, but the final, most important piece of the puzzle was Bernadotte's famously terrible relationship with Napoleon. This is what made him the perfect high-risk, high-reward choice. Cause: Murner, conducting his rogue search in Paris, needs a candidate who is both a top-tier French marshal and plausibly independent from Napoleon. Effect: he analyzes the available marshals, dismissing the Bonaparte family members and the pathologically loyal, and instead focuses on Jean Bernadotte, a man whose profile is a unique mix of military fame, administrative experience, personal wealth, and a reputation for kindness towards Swedes. Consequence: Murner locks onto Bernadotte as his sole target, primarily because Bernadotte's well-known professional rivalry and personal friction with Napoleon make him the only candidate who might actually be willing to prioritize Sweden's interests over France's. Murner's logic was brilliant in its audacity. He was looking for one of the most powerful military men in the world, and his number one criterion was, essentially, must not get along well with his boss. He was betting that Bernadotte's personal ambition and resentment towards Napoleon were stronger than his loyalty to France. He was betting he could appeal to the disgruntled superstar, the guy who felt he was being held back by the CEO. It was a psychological gamble on a massive scale. Now that he had his man, Murner just had to figure out how to approach a prince of the empire and make the most absurd, unsolicited job offer in the history of the world. So, Karl Otto Murner has his target locked: Jean-Baptiste Jules Bernadotte. But who is this guy? Really, to understand why he was the perfect, paradoxical choice, we need to look under the hood of the man who Napoleon Bonaparte could never quite figure out, never quite trust, and never quite get rid of. He was, without a doubt, the most frustratingly independent of all the emperor's superstar generals. First off, forget any ideas about noble blood. Bernadotte was a self-made man, a pure product of the French Revolution's chaotic meritocracy. He was born in the southern French town of Pau, the son of a provincial lawyer. He joined the king's army as a lowly private and was still a sergeant major. After more than a decade of service, then in 1789, the revolution hit, and the whole world turned upside down. The old aristocratic officer corps was purged, creating a vacuum that ambitious, talented commoners like Bernadotte could fill, and fill it he did. He rocketed up the ranks, fueled by a combination of genuine talent, soaring ambition, and a passionate belief in the new Republican ideals. He was a true believer, a Jacobin at heart. This is key. His entire political DNA was forged in the anti-monarchist fires of the Revolution. He wasn't loyal to a man or a crown. He was loyal to an idea. Physically, he looked the part. He was tall, with a mane of dark, curly hair, intense eyes, and the beak-like nose of a Roman eagle. He was a Gascon, from a region of France known for producing proud, fiery, and fiercely independent men. He had charisma to burn, but it was backed by a colossal ego and a flair for the theatrical. And according to legend, somewhere on his arm, He had a tattoo he'd gotten in his radical youth that read Mort aux Rois, Death to Kings. The existence of this tattoo is debated by historians, but it's so perfectly ironic that we have to believe it's true. A man marked with Death to Kings was now being scouted for a kingship. You can't make this stuff up. His relationship with Napoleon Bonaparte was a dumpster fire from day one. They weren't friends who had a falling out, they were rivals who were forced to work together. Their paths crossed during the Italian campaigns, where they were both ambitious young generals making a name for themselves. The rivalry was immediately personal, thanks to a woman named Desiree Clary. The daughter of a wealthy silk merchant, Desiree was once engaged to Napoleon. He unceremoniously dumped her for the better-connected and more useful Josephine de Beauharnais. Not long after, Bernadotte swept in and married Desiree to make things even more cosmically awkward. Desiree's older sister Julie had married Napoleon's brother, Joseph. This made Bernadotte and Napoleon brothers-in-law. They were trapped together at the world's most powerful and dysfunctional family Thanksgiving dinner for the rest of their lives. Their rivalry wasn't just personal, it was political. When Napoleon staged his coup in 1799 to seize power, the staunchly Republican Bernadotte refused to help him. In fact, he was one of the few powerful figures who could have potentially stopped him. Napoleon never forgot or forgave this lack of support. He saw Bernadotte not as a subordinate, but as a potential challenger, even after Napoleon made him a marshal. Bernadotte was a constant headache. He was brilliant on the battlefield, but he was his own biggest fan. He was notorious for acting independently, for questioning orders, and for only showing up when the battle promised him personal glory. At the decisive twin battles of Jena Auerstedt in 1806, Bernadotte's entire army corps somehow managed to miss both fights entirely. Marching uselessly between them, Napoleon was so enraged he nearly had him court-martialed. 3 years later, at the bloody Battle of Wagram, Bernadotte's corps broke and ran. In an attempt to save face, he issued a proclamation praising his troops for their valor. This was the last straw for Napoleon, who publicly humiliated him and stripped him of his command on the spot. This all leads to a clear and disastrous chain of events for their relationship. Cause: Bernadotte's fierce Republican ideology, towering personal ambition, an awkward marital link to the Bonaparte clan put him in direct and permanent opposition to Napoleon's quest for absolute power. Effect: their entire professional relationship was defined by a toxic brew of personal animosity, political suspicion, and repeated instances of military insubordination from Bernadotte. Consequence: by 1810, Marshal Bernadotte was a man of immense fame and prestige, but he was effectively unemployed, disgraced, and politically sidelined by the emperor, leaving him powerful, available, and keenly looking for any opportunity that served his own interests, not Napoleon's. You see, Bernadotte was the ultimate paradox that Murner needed. He was a man who owed his entire career to the new Napoleonic system, yet resented its master. He was a prince of the empire who still dreamed Republican dreams. He was the perfect anti-hero for this story. Brilliant, charismatic, and utterly, magnificently self-serving. Sweden didn't just need a general. It needed a man whose ambition was so vast that it could swallow a kingdom whole. And in the summer of 1810, the disgraced, restless, and deeply ambitious Jean Bernadotte was sitting in Paris, a ticking time bomb of potential, just waiting for a crazy young Swede with an even crazier idea to come knocking. Karl Otto Murner had his man. He'd done the background check, analyzed the psychological profile, and concluded that Jean Bernadotte was the one. Now came the hard part. How does a 29-year-old lieutenant with no authority and a questionable mission statement get a private audience with a prince of the French Empire? You can't just send a LinkedIn request. Murner had to navigate the intricate social and political web of Napoleonic Paris, a world of protocols, introductions, and gatekeepers. He found his way in through a French general named Fournier, an acquaintance of Bernadotte's who was friendly to the Swedes. Murner, with all the conviction of a true believer, laid out his insane plan. Fournier was likely dumbstruck, but also intrigued enough by the sheer audacity of it all to agree to arrange a meeting. The moment of truth arrived. Murner was ushered into Bernadotte's lavish Parisian residence. The power imbalance in that room must have been staggering. On one side, you have Jean Bernadotte, Marshal of the Empire, Prince of Pontecorvo, a celebrated war hero, a seasoned political operator, a man who argued with Napoleon and lived. On the other side, you have Karl Otto Murner, a foreign lieutenant, a minor noble, a man whose official mission was to buy artificial limbs. He was a nobody, about to make the most important sales pitch of his life, and the product he was selling was the future of his own country. Murner, undoubtedly nervous but fueled by patriotic adrenaline, did not waste time with pleasantries. He launched into what can only be described as the most audacious, unsolicited job offer in history. It was a masterclass in appealing to a man's ego. He began by painting a bleak picture of Sweden's reality. "Your Highness," he would have begun, "my country is on its knees. We have an old king who cannot rule and has no heir. The man we chose to succeed him is dead. Our government is deadlocked. About to hand our sovereignty to Denmark, our ancient enemy. The Swedish army, the Swedish people, are in despair. He established the problem, now the solution. But there is hope," Murner continued, leaning in, a powerful and growing sentiment, especially among the officers of the army, "is that our salvation cannot come from the old royal houses. We need a new kind of leader. We need a soldier, a great captain of the modern age, who can rebuild our army, restore our pride, and whose name alone can command the respect of Europe." He buttered him up, framing the job as one only a military demigod could handle. Then he dropped the bombshell. "That is why I am here. We believe you, Prince of Pontecorvo, are that man. Your military genius is second to none, but more than that, your name is remembered with respect in my country. Your honorable treatment of our soldiers in Pomerania proved you are a man of character as well as a man of war. The patriots of Sweden believe you are the only one who possesses the strength, the skill, and the independence to save us. I am here, unofficially, to ask, if the crown of Sweden were offered to you, would you accept it?" This was not a conversation, it was a detonation. How did Bernadotte react? A lesser man might have laughed or gotten angry, or called the guards to throw this presumptuous little officer out on the street. But Bernadotte was a supremely canny political animal. He was also a man whose ambition was a living, breathing thing. He listened to every word with unnerving stillness. He was almost certainly stunned and deeply suspicious. Was this a trick from his enemies in Paris? A test of loyalty from the emperor himself? But as Murner spoke, the suspicion in Bernadotte's eyes must have been slowly crowded out by the gleam of pure, unadulterated opportunity. A kingdom, not some joke of a principality like Pontecorvo, but a real, historic, respectable European kingdom. A chance to have his own army, his own foreign policy. A chance to finally step out of Napoleon's suffocating shadow and become his equal. The gears in his head were spinning at 1,000 revolutions per minute. He played his cards perfectly. He didn't leap at the offer. He remained dignified, thoughtful. He gave Murner a response that was a masterpiece of non-committal encouragement. He spoke of his duty to France, his loyalty to the emperor. But then he added the magic words, something to the effect of, "I cannot seek such an honor. But if the Swedish people, through their elected representatives, were to freely choose me, I would be proud to serve them." This was the critical moment in our chain of events. Karl Otto Murner, using a back-channel introduction, gains a private audience with his chosen candidate, Marshal Bernadotte. Effect, Murner bypasses all subtlety and directly pitches the Swedish crown to Bernadotte, flattering his ego and appealing to his legendary ambition with the promise of a kingdom of his own. Consequence, Bernadotte, though cautious, is profoundly hooked by the offer. He gives Murner a carefully worded but unmistakably positive signal, which transforms Murner's completely rogue mission from a suicidal fantasy into a tangible, semi-viable political project. This entire meeting was one of the greatest bits of political theater of the 19th century. Think about it, a job interview where the interviewer has no authority to hire. The candidate isn't officially on the market, and the job itself isn't technically open yet. It was a conversation conducted entirely in the language of hypotheticals and plausible deniability. If it all went wrong, Bernadotte could simply say he entertained the ramblings of a mad young Swede for a few minutes and forgot all about it, but it didn't go wrong. Murner walked out of that meeting without a firm yes, but he had something much more important. He had a fish on the line, a very, very big fish. So, the seed of the idea has been planted. Murner made the pitch, and Bernadotte, the ambitious, disgruntled Marshal, is interested. But now, the entire insane project hinges on one man, Napoleon Bonaparte. Everything had to go through him. His approval was the final checkpoint, and his no could vaporize the entire plan instantly. And this is where the genius of Murner's choice becomes so beautifully, chaotically complicated. Because Jean Bernadotte was simultaneously the single worst and the single best candidate for this job. And it all came down to his toxic, decade-spanning, profoundly dysfunctional relationship with the Emperor of the French. Let's start with the cons list from Napoleon's perspective. Why was putting Bernadotte on the Swedish throne a monumentally stupid idea? For starters, there was the trust issue, or rather, the complete lack of it. Napoleon knew Bernadotte was loyal to one person, Jean Bernadotte. He was the perpetual rival, the one great general who had never been fully absorbed into the cult of personality around the emperor. Napoleon had installed his brothers and in-laws on thrones across Europe: Louis in Holland, Joseph in Spain, Murat in Naples. They were often incompetent, but they were his guys. Bernadotte was not. He was the ambitious brother-in-law you suspect is trying to steal your company. Giving him an independent kingdom was like handing a box of matches to a pyromaniac and hoping he'll only use it to light your birthday candles. Then there was the long, well-documented history of insubordination. Napoleon had a memory like an elephant, and his file on Bernadotte was thick with grievances. The political opposition during the coup, the mysterious disappearing act at the Battle of Jena, the public disgrace at Wagram. Every incident had reinforced the same lesson. Bernadotte could not be relied upon to follow the script. He was a freelancer in a system that demanded absolute obedience. To willingly make him a king, a sovereign ruler with his own army, seemed like an act of strategic self-harm. Why empower the one subordinate who had consistently proven himself to be a massive headache? It made no sense. But now, let's flip the coin. From the Swedish perspective, every one of Napoleon's cons was a glorious pro. This is what Murner and the patriotic faction were gambling on. The fact that Napoleon didn't trust him. Perfect. That meant he wouldn't be a puppet. A king Napoleon couldn't control was exactly the kind of king Sweden needed to maintain its independence. Bernadotte's history of insubordination. Fantastic. It was a resume of a man who knew how to put his own interests first. And the Swedes were betting that his new interests would be Swedish interests. They weren't hiring a French viceroy, they were hiring a CEO for Team Sweden. And his track record of prioritizing himself was, ironically, a huge selling point. Furthermore, despite all the bad blood, Bernadotte was still a known quantity. He was an insider. He understood the complex power dynamics of the French Empire in a way no outsider ever could. He knew Napoleon's strengths, his weaknesses, his vanities. He could speak to the emperor as a reluctant peer, not as a trembling subordinate. For Sweden, this was invaluable. He was a bridge to the most powerful man in the world, even if that bridge was structurally unsound and prone to catching fire. This brings us to the core paradox of the whole situation. Cause: Bernadotte's entire professional and personal life has been defined by his fractious, semi-hostile, and deeply competitive relationship with Napoleon. Effect: this history makes him a terrifyingly risky candidate for Napoleon to endorse for a foreign throne, as the emperor knows he is fundamentally untrustworthy and driven by his own agenda. Consequence: yet this exact same history makes him the ideal candidate for Swedish nationalists, who see his proven independence from Napoleon not as a flaw but as the single most desirable feature, creating a bizarre scenario where the candidate's greatest liability is also his greatest asset. It's impossible to overstate how much this entire affair rested on pure psychology. The fate of a kingdom wasn't going to be decided by treaties or strategic documents. It was going to be decided by a personality clash. It was a bet on Napoleon's ego. The Swedes were hoping that the emperor's desire to be rid of a domestic political rival would outweigh his strategic common sense. They were betting he would be short-sighted enough to think that exporting his Bernadotte problem was the same as solving it. For his part, Bernadotte had to walk the finest of tightropes. He had to reassure the Swedes of his future independence, while simultaneously convincing Napoleon of his future loyalty. It was a double game of epic proportions. The question now hung heavy in the air of Paris. What would the emperor do? Would he crush this audacious proposal, or would he, for reasons of his own, let it proceed? The future of the House of Bernadotte depended entirely on the mood of its greatest rival. The fish was on the line. Bernadotte was interested now. It was time to get permission from the man who owned the entire lake. The whole wild, improbable scheme, born in the mind of a rogue lieutenant, now had to pass through the hands of the master of Europe. Bernadotte, the canny operator, knew he couldn't be seen actively campaigning for this job. That would be unseemly and would certainly anger Napoleon. Instead, he let the Bernadotte idea marinate among the official Swedish diplomats in Paris. Murner's infectious enthusiasm, combined with the sheer star power of the candidate, started to win them over. The official envoy, Baron Lagerbielk, who was supposed to be pushing for the Danish prince, slowly came to the realization that a French marshal was a much bigger prize. The rogue mission was merging with the official one. With this semi-official backing, Bernadotte made his move. He requested an audience with the emperor. This wasn't a conversation between equals, it was a subordinate asking for a favor. And Bernadotte played the part to perfection. He presented the situation with calculated humility. He explained that, to his surprise, his name had been floated as a potential successor to the Swedish throne. He was a loyal soldier of France, he insisted, devoted to his emperor. He would never seek such a thing himself, but the Swedes were being very persuasive. What was His Majesty's counsel? It was a masterful performance of a man being reluctantly swept away by destiny, all while desperately hoping destiny would hurry up and sweep him away. Napoleon listened, and the fate of Sweden, of Bernadotte, and ultimately a not insignificant part of his own empire, was decided in the cold calculus of his mind. And his conclusion was one of the great, unforced errors of his entire career. First, and perhaps most importantly, Napoleon was just sick of Bernadotte. He was tired of the drama, the rivalry, the perceived slights, the constant management of this one prickly, oversized ego in his stable of generals. Getting him out of Paris, out of France, out of his hair. The idea was deeply appealing. It was addition by subtraction. Sending his most annoying Marshal to the frozen hinterlands of Scandinavia felt less like losing a great general and more like finally getting rid of a rock in his shoe. Second, Napoleon fell victim to his own arrogance. He fundamentally believed in what we can call the puppet theory. He assumed that a French marshal, raised by the revolution, given titles and wealth by the empire, would be a Frenchman first and a Swede second. He saw Bernadotte on the Swedish throne not as an independent king, but as a French governor with a crown. He believed Bernadotte would be his man in Stockholm, diligently enforcing the continental system against Great Britain, keeping Russia in check, and essentially turning the Baltic into a French lake. He thought he was installing a loyal viceroy. He completely failed to grasp that he was empowering a man whose ambition was now about to be fused with the desperate nationalism of an entire country. Third, Napoleon simply didn't take Sweden that seriously. In the grand, bloody theater of his empire, Sweden was a sideshow. He was juggling the ongoing, ulcer-inducing war in Spain, managing the fragile peace with Austria, and keeping a wary eye on the colossal power of Russia. The question of who sat on the throne in Stockholm was, to him, a trivial matter. He underestimated the country's strategic importance and its capacity to act. This lack of attention led him to make a snap judgment based on convenience, rather than deep strategic thought. So, when Bernadotte stood before him, feigning loyalty, Napoleon looked at the situation and shrugged. He gave his consent, not with a cheer, not with a grand endorsement, but with a weary, almost bored wave of his hand. The historical accounts have him saying something to the effect of, "I was expecting it. Very well, let our destinies be accomplished." He made Bernadotte formally renounce his French citizenship and swear an oath that he would never bear arms against France, an oath that would later prove to be written in disappearing ink. And so, the decision was made, based on a catastrophic miscalculation. Cause, Bernadotte, with the now official backing of the Swedish envoy, formally presents his candidacy to Napoleon, framing it as a surprising honor he feels compelled to consider. Effect, Napoleon, weighing the decision, is swayed primarily by his personal desire to remove a political nuisance from Paris, and his arrogant assumption that any French marshal on a foreign throne would automatically serve French interests. Consequence, he gives his official, yet dismissive, consent for Bernadotte to become Crown Prince of Sweden, committing a monumental strategic blunder by believing he was exporting a domestic problem rather than creating a powerful future enemy. This was the moment, this was the pivot. Napoleon thought he was cleverly solving a personnel issue. He thought he was playing chess and neatly exchanging a troublesome knight for a useful pawn. He had absolutely no idea he had just handed his opponent a queen. His decision, driven by petty grievances and imperial hubris, had set in motion a chain of events that would come back to haunt him in the most spectacular way imaginable. He had personally approved the elevation of the one man in his orbit with the ambition, the skill, and now the motivation to one day stand against him. The emperor had spoken. The deal was greenlit. Now, all they had to do was tell the Swedish government what had been decided for them. The deal was done in Paris, the city of lights, high fashion, and now, apparently, the place where the future of the Swedish monarchy was being decided without consulting the Swedes. Back in Sweden, the government was completely oblivious, trudging along with all the speed and excitement of a PowerPoint presentation on tax law. The Riksdag of the Estates wasn't even meeting in Stockholm. The city was still considered too volatile after the whole mob lynching incident. Instead, they had convened in the sleepy provincial town of Grebro to elect a new crown prince. The air was thick with political maneuvering. The king's party was pushing their candidate, Denmark, to point zero, with all the uninspired determination of a team trying to sell a product nobody wants. The nationalist opposition was fuming, fighting a desperate rearguard action, but lacking a champion of their own. The process was grinding, miserable, and deadlocked into this stagnant pond of political misery. A messenger from Paris dropped a boulder. Dispatches arrived from the official envoy, Baron Lagerbielk, but more importantly, word began to spread from the letters carried by supporters of Karl Otto Murner, who had raced back home. The news was delivered like a series of grenade blasts. First, there is a new candidate, a French marshal named Bernadotte. Second, he's a military legend, a prince of the empire, and he's interested. And the third, final, mind-annihilating blast, Napoleon has already given his blessing. The Swedish government, the king, his ministers, the whole secret committee, they all found out about their new star candidate at the same time as everyone else. Imagine being the CEO of a company, and you find out from a newspaper headline that a rogue intern has promised the vice presidency to a top executive at a rival corporation, and that rival CEO has already approved the transfer. The reaction in Grebro was not joy or relief. It was a collective, five-alarm political heart attack. Their first response was pure, undiluted fury, aimed squarely at the man who had caused all this chaos. Who the hell is Lieutenant Karl Otto Murner? Who gave this nobody the authority to offer up the kingdom like a party favor? This was an act of unprecedented, treasonous insubordination. When Murner arrived back in Sweden, expecting a hero's welcome, he was promptly placed under house arrest for daring to bypass the entire command structure of the nation. The government tried to stuff the genie back in the bottle. They tried to suppress the news. Pay no attention to these wild rumors from Paris, was the official line. The election will proceed as planned. Their second reaction was sheer terror. They were staring into a political fog of war. Was this Napoleon's doing? Was this a power play? Were they being subtly strong-armed into accepting a French general to turn Sweden into a vassal state? They had been outmaneuvered so completely that they didn't even know who was making the moves. The feeling of powerlessness was infuriating. They were supposed to be choosing their own destiny, and instead, it felt like their destiny had been chosen for them by a French emperor and a Swedish lieutenant who had gone spectacularly off script, but their attempt to shut it down was like trying to put out a forest fire with a water pistol. The news was too big, too exciting, too perfect. Cause the shocking news of Murner's unauthorized deal with Bernadotte. A deal already approved by Napoleon arrives in Sweden, while the government is still deadlocked over the Danish candidate. Effect, the Swedish king and his ministers react with panicked fury, arresting Murner for his flagrant insubordination, and desperately trying to suppress the Bernadotte candidacy as an illegitimate rogue operation. Consequence, their clumsy attempt at suppression backfires spectacularly. The news electrifies the anti-Danish opposition, throws the entire election into chaos, and instantly transforms Bernadotte from an unknown foreigner into a populist legend, making his candidacy the unavoidable center of gravity in Swedish politics. The government's heavy-handed reaction only made Bernadotte more popular. He was now the anti-establishment candidate. Murner, sitting under house arrest, became a martyr for the cause. The Swedish party had their champion, a candidate who was not only a military superhero, but also one who apparently annoyed their own stuffy, incompetent leaders. Pro-Bernadotte propaganda, likely financed by the Marshal's own agents, began to flood the town of Grebro. Pamphlets appeared overnight, singing his praises, hailing him as the savior who would restore Sweden's military glory. The name Bernadotte was on everyone's lips. He was the fresh, exciting, Napoleon-approved solution to all their problems. The government wanted to talk about a Danish prince. The people wanted to talk about the French war god. The old men in charge had lost control of the narrative, and the story was now far too good to be stopped. The Swedish government tried to slam the door on the Bernadotte affair, but they quickly discovered the door had been blown off its hinges, and the house was now full of party guests they hadn't invited. Their attempts to punish Karl Otto Murner and pretend his rogue mission never happened were a spectacular failure. In fact, it had the opposite effect. By making Murner a political prisoner, they turned him into a celebrity. By trying to squash the rumor of a French marshal, they fanned the flames of a political firestorm. The idea of Bernadotte as king was simply too good, too potent, and too perfectly timed to be ignored. It was an idea that refused to die. The atmosphere in Grebro, where the Riksdag was convened, transformed from a stuffy political debate into a full-blown lobbying frenzy. The anti-Danish nationalists, who had been on the defensive, suddenly had a superstar candidate. They went on the offensive, and their sales pitch was brutally simple and effective. It boiled down to a single, powerful image: a king with a sword in hand. Sweden was weak, they argued. Their army was demoralized, their nation humiliated. What good was another well-meaning but militarily irrelevant prince? What Sweden needed, what this dangerous age demanded, was a warrior king, a man forged in the fires of the Napoleonic Wars. And who better than Marshal Bernadotte? Pro-Bernadotte pamphlets presented him as a living legend. They spoke of his tactical genius, his charisma, his experience commanding vast armies. He wouldn't just be an heir, he would be a walking, talking national security strategy. The argument was almost primal in its appeal. In a world of wolves, Sweden needed to hire the biggest wolf they could find. The Danish prince offered diplomacy and a potential union. Bernadotte offered strength, glory, and the promise that no one would dare kick Sweden around ever again. Then there was the Napoleon factor, which the Bernadotte supporters wielded like a club. The Emperor of the French, the master of the continent, had personally approved this candidacy. Could Sweden, in its weakened state, afford to publicly reject a candidate Napoleon had greenlit? It would be a slap in the face to the most powerful man in the world. Approving Bernadotte wasn't just a choice. It was the safe choice from a foreign policy perspective. It was a way to get back into Napoleon's good graces. The logic was inescapable. Bernadotte was both the strong choice and the smart choice. The pressure on the ruling establishment became immense. Foreign Minister Lars von Engström and the other ministers who had been backing the Danish candidate could feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. They were realists. They could see they were losing the argument in the court of public opinion, or at least the opinion of the politically important people in Rebrands. The momentum for Bernadotte was becoming a tidal wave. They could either stand in front of it and be drowned, or they could grab a surfboard. Reluctantly, grimly, they started looking for a surfboard. One by one, the pillars of the establishment began to crumble. The secret committee, which had been horrified by Murner's actions, now saw the political reality. They reversed their position. Even old King Charles XIII, who was probably bewildered by the whole affair, was eventually convinced. He was persuaded that this strange French general was the only candidate popular enough and powerful enough to secure the throne for his adopted line. The government didn't just change its mind. It was dragged, kicking and screaming, to a conclusion that had become unavoidable. The climax of this political drama followed a clear, relentless logic. Cause, the powerful, romantic appeal of a sword-in-hand military savior, combined with the immense geopolitical weight of Napoleon's approval, creates an unstoppable wave of support for Bernadotte within the Swedish Riksdag. Effect, the Swedish government's establishment, seeing their own candidate's support evaporate and facing overwhelming political pressure, reluctantly abandons its resistance and capitulates to the popular will. Consequence, on August 21, 1810, the Riksdag of the Estates formally elects Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte as the new crown prince of Sweden, officially transforming a rogue lieutenant's active insubordination into the policy of the state. The vote was a landslide. The idea that wouldn't die had not only survived, it had conquered. Karl Otto Murner was released from house arrest and hailed as a national hero. The man who had committed a textbook act of diplomatic sabotage was now the toast of the town. The visionary, who had saved the nation from its own timid leaders. It was a stunning victory for audacity over caution. The Swedish government had wanted a safe, predictable, manageable heir. Instead, through a bizarre series of events driven by desperation, luck, and the magnificent nerve of one junior officer, they were getting a famously independent, notoriously ambitious French war hero with a Death to Kings tattoo. The deal was sealed. The contract was signed. Now, all they had to do was wait for their new king to arrive. The news of his election reached Jean Bernadotte in Paris, and he played the part of the surprised and humbled servant of destiny to perfection. An official delegation of Swedes arrived, bowing and scraping, to formally offer him the position of crown prince. With a carefully crafted speech about honor, duty, and the will of the Swedish people, he accepted. The most insane long shot in European politics had paid off. He had won a kingdom. Now he just had to figure out how to run it. But first, he had to quit his old job. And that was a little more complicated than giving the week's notice. This kicked off what can only be described as the world's most extreme and rapid rebranding campaign. Bernadotte, the French Marshal, had to die, and in his place, a Swedish crown prince had to be born. It was a complete identity overhaul, and it had to happen immediately. First, there were the logistics. Bernadotte was a prince of the empire, a marshal of France. He had titles to renounce, properties in France and Italy to sell, and a whole life to pack up. He and his wife Desiree held a massive fire sale of their assets, taking out huge loans against their fortune to ensure they arrived in Sweden with a mountain of liquid cash. This was crucial. He wasn't showing up as a charity case. He was showing up as a wealthy, independent operator, a man who could contribute to the bankrupt Swedish treasury, not drain it. He was funding his own startup kingdom. The family situation was tense. His young son, Oscar, was now a prince of a foreign land, a life-changing promotion. His wife, Desiree Clary, however, was horrified. She was a queen of Parisian society, a woman who lived for the glamour and excitement of the imperial capital. The thought of moving to Stockholm, a city she imagined as a frozen, provincial backwater full of grim-faced Lutherans, was her personal vision of hell. She agreed to go, but her enthusiasm level was somewhere around zero. This was not a good omen. With the finances and family sorted for now, the real rebranding work began. Bernadotte understood that symbols mattered. He couldn't arrive as a conquering hero. He had to arrive as a long-lost son. Step 1. The name. Jean-Baptiste Jules Bernadotte was a mouthful of French syllables. It would never work. The solution was simple and brilliant. The current king was Charles XIII or Karl XIII. To create a sense of continuity, Bernadotte would adopt a new, suitably regal and Scandinavian-sounding name, Karl Johann, Charles John. It connected him directly to his new father and sounded instantly legitimate. Jean-Baptiste was out. Karl Johann was in. Step 2. The religion. This was non-negotiable. The Swedish constitution stipulated that the monarch had to be a true Lutheran. Bernadotte was a lifelong Catholic, albeit a rather casual one typical of the French revolutionary generation. For him, changing his religion was less a matter of spiritual crisis and more a pragmatic business decision. He needed to be Lutheran to be king. Fine. Sign him up. He agreed to convert without a fuss, treating it as another box to be ticked on his royal job application. Step 3. The adoption. This was perhaps the most surreal part of the entire process. To make the succession legal and conform to tradition, the 61-year-old, frail, childless King Charles XIII had to formally adopt the 47-year-old, battle-hardened, world-famous Jean Bernadotte as his son. Let that image sink in. It is the legal equivalent of a retirement home resident adopting a CEO in the prime of his career. It was a bizarre, necessary fiction to smooth over the fact that they had just hired a complete stranger off the street, or in this case, off the battlefield. This entire whirlwind of preparation formed a critical chain of events for his transformation. Cause, having been formally elected as Crown Prince, Jean Bernadotte accepts the offer and begins the complex process of severing his ties to France and preparing for his new life. Effect, he recognizes that to be seen as a legitimate Swedish leader rather than a French import, he must undergo a rapid and radical rebranding campaign, which includes securing independent financing, choosing a new Swedish name Karl Johann, and agreeing to convert to Lutheranism and be legally adopted by the elderly king. Consequence, these pragmatic and highly symbolic actions serve as the crucial first steps in transforming Marshal Bernadotte into Crown Prince Karl Johann, demonstrating his commitment to his new role before he even sets foot in the country. This was the most intense corporate onboarding process of all time. Welcome to Sweden, Ob. We're thrilled to have you as our future CEO. Now, a few housekeeping items. Please change your name to sound more local. Convert to the state religion. Let our current CEO legally adopt you. And by the way, we can't afford your moving expenses, so you'll have to cover that yourself. Orientation is on Monday. Good luck. It was a testament to Bernadotte's ruthless pragmatism. He was willing to change his name, his faith, and even his legal parentage to secure the ultimate prize. The Swedes, for their part, were so desperate for a savior that they were willing to embrace the sheer absurdity of it all. With his affairs in order and his new identity roughed out, Karl Johann, the Crown Prince-elect, said goodbye to France and set off for his new home. With his new name picked out and his affairs in France settled, it was time for Karl Johann to meet his new country. In the autumn of 1810, he set off on the long journey north. This was the point of no return. He traveled across Europe, a continent that was largely his old boss's personal chessboard, heading for a new life in a kingdom he'd only ever known as an adversary. The final, symbolic step was the short boat ride across the Riesen Strait, from Helsingør in Denmark to the shores of Helsingborg, Sweden. As he stepped onto Swedish soil for the first time on October 20, 1810, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, Marshal of France, effectively ceased to exist. In his place stood Karl Johann, Crown Prince of Sweden, a man about to embark on the ultimate crash course in how to become a king. The Swedes who greeted him saw exactly what they had hoped for. This was no stooped, paunchy monarch. This was a man in the prime of his life, tall, athletic, with the piercing eyes and commanding presence of a man who was used to having his orders obeyed instantly. His charisma was immediate and palpable. He looked, every inch, like the savior they had been promised. His first and most important meeting was with the man he was about to call father, King Charles XIII, old, sickly, and weary. was brought to meet his new heir. The visual contrast was a perfect metaphor for Sweden's situation. Here was the old, fading Sweden, legitimate, royal, but exhausted and frail. And beside him was the new, vibrant Sweden, a meritocratic, energetic force of nature. A commoner by birth, but a king in bearing. The old king was charmed and, more importantly, relieved. This man, he could see, was more than capable of taking over. Now came the formal initiation, a rapid-fire series of ceremonies designed to complete his rebranding in the eyes of the state and the church. This was his royal onboarding, and he had to pass every test. First up was the religious conversion. This was no private affair. Carl Johan was given a crash course in the Lutheran catechism by a Swedish archbishop. Then, in a solemn public ceremony, the former Catholic formally renounced the faith of his birth and was received into the Lutheran Church. He played the part of the sincere convert to perfection, his face a mask of pious gravity. Whether he truly felt a spiritual calling or simply saw it as a necessary political sacrament, no one knew for sure. But he understood the theater of power, and he gave a flawless performance. One major box was ticked. Next came the legal and political transformation. Before the assembled Riksdag of the Estates, the final, surreal act of the adoption took place. King Charles XIII, in a quavering voice, formally declared this 47-year-old French general to be his beloved son. With that, the legal fiction was complete. He was then officially proclaimed His Royal Highness Crown Prince Carl Johan. The name change was now official. The adoption was law. The succession was secure. Then, it was his turn to speak, standing before his new countrymen. He delivered his inaugural address. He couldn't speak a word of Swedish, of course, so he spoke in French, the international language of diplomacy, but his words, translated for the assembly, were pure political gold. He pledged his eternal gratitude, his undying loyalty to his new father and his new nation. He had been a soldier for France, he declared, but from this day forward, all his efforts, his entire being, would be dedicated to the honor, prosperity, and defense of Sweden. He was theirs now, completely. It was a barnstormer of a speech, delivered with the confidence of a man who had commanded armies. The Swedish politicians were utterly captivated. This whirlwind of ceremonial success formed the climax of his arrival. Cause, the newly named Carl Johan arrives in Sweden to a reception of immense curiosity and hope, needing to immediately solidify his legitimacy. Effect, he masterfully navigates the required set pieces of his public rebranding. A formal conversion to Lutheranism, a legal adoption by the king, and a powerful inaugural speech pledging his absolute loyalty to his new homeland. Consequence, these perfectly executed performances instantly win over the Swedish political class and the public, cementing his status as the undisputed heir and completing his improbable transformation from a foreign general into the nation as chosen savior. You have to appreciate the sheer performative brilliance of it all. Carl Johan was an actor who had been given the role of a lifetime, and he didn't miss a single cue. The Swedes, for their part, were the most willing audience in the world. They needed to believe that this rebranding was real, that this stranger was now one of them, and so, they did. They collectively agreed to accept the performance as reality. The only person who couldn't get with the program was his wife, Desiree. She took one look at the cold weather, the formal court, and the distinct lack of Parisian glamour and basically went into shock. Her misery was a small, awkward footnote on an otherwise triumphant debut. The crash course was over. Carl Johan had passed with flying colors. He was no longer a candidate. He was the crown prince, and he was about to start running the country. Carl Johan did not come to Sweden to be a ceremonial placeholder. He was the type to spend his days learning court etiquette and waiting for the old king to die. He was a commander, an administrator, a man whose entire life had been a whirlwind of action, and from the moment he arrived, he began to act. The Swedish government, and indeed the king himself, quickly realized they hadn't just imported an heir, they had imported a new boss. The power shift was immediate and total. King Charles XIII was, by all accounts, thrilled to have someone else take over the stressful business of running a country. His health, already fragile, conveniently took a nosedive shortly after Carl Johan's arrival. He suffered a stroke, which gave the government the perfect pretext to do what everyone wanted to do anyway. They officially appointed Crown Prince Carl Johan as regent, granting him the full authority of a monarch. Just a few weeks after stepping off the boat, our French Marshal was the de facto king of Sweden. The old king retired to a life of quiet dignity, while the new CEO rolled up his sleeves and got to work. His first 100 days were a masterclass in crisis management. He was a man taking over a failing company, and he immediately started plugging the holes. First, the money. Sweden was broke. Karl Johan, who had arrived with a considerable personal fortune, used his own funds as collateral for emergency loans. He brought a soldier's discipline to the chaotic state budget, slashing wasteful spending and demanding accountability. The Swedish ministers, used to a more languid pace, were stunned by his work ethic and his grasp of detail. He was a workaholic who chaired every meeting and read every report, communicating through a team of translators. Next, the military. This was his turf. The Swedish army was demoralized, its reputation in tatters after the loss of Finland. Karl Johan began a sweeping series of reforms. He introduced the efficient French divisional system, modernized training doctrines, and most importantly, restored a sense of pride and professionalism. His very presence a legendary Marshal of the Empire. Now their commander was a shot of pure adrenaline to the army's morale. For the first time in years, the Swedish military began to believe in itself again. But the most dangerous and immediate crisis was not internal, it was foreign policy. Napoleon had not approved this deal out of the goodness of his heart. He expected a return on his investment. The French minister in Stockholm immediately presented the new regent with a list of demands. At the top of the list, Sweden must immediately and unequivocally join the continental system. This meant declaring war on Great Britain, Sweden's largest trading partner. This was the ultimate loyalty test. Karl Johan was trapped. He was in power because of Napoleon's blessing. To defy him now, so early in his tenure, would be to invite the wrath of the French Empire. And a French invasion was a very real possibility. But to obey would be economically suicidal for Sweden. A war with Britain would cripple the shipping and iron industries. That kept the Swedish economy afloat. It was a choice between ruin and ruin. So, he chose a third option, strategic deception. He would give Napoleon the war he wanted, but only on paper. Cause, taking full control of the government as regent. The energetic Karl Johan immediately begins implementing sweeping reforms to Sweden's shattered finances and demoralized military. Effect, his competence and drive quickly impressed the Swedish establishment. But he is immediately confronted with an ultimatum from Napoleon: declare war on Great Britain, or face the consequences. Consequence, trapped between defying his former master and ruining his new country, Karl Johan engineers a phony war, formally declaring hostilities against Britain in November 1810, but ensuring that no actual fighting occurs and that secret trade continues, buying himself time and tipping his hand as a master of subtle defiance. This was the famous Anglo-Swedish War of 1810. 1812, the fakest war of the entire Napoleonic era. War was declared, diplomats were recalled, and then nothing. Not a single shot was fired. Not a single ship was sunk. It was a war conducted entirely through angry letters, secretly. Swedish and British merchants used 1,000 loopholes to continue their trade. It was a masterpiece of political theater, designed to give Napoleon the headline he wanted while changing nothing on the ground. This was the first clear sign that Napoleon had made a terrible mistake. He thought he had installed a loyal bulldog who would obey his every command. He was quickly discovering that he had, in fact, installed a cunning fox who had a playbook all his own. The game had begun, and Karl Johan's first move was not one of loyalty, but of quiet, calculated subversion. Having deftly navigated his first diplomatic crisis with Napoleon, by creating the fakest war in modern history, Karl Johan could now turn his attention to the great, festering wound in the Swedish national soul, Finland. This was the awkward elephant in every room. The loss of Finland was the national trauma that had led to the coup, the succession crisis, and his own improbable election. The unspoken promise, the fervent hope of every Swede who had supported his candidacy, was that this legendary warrior prince, this sword in hand, would be the man to finally avenge their humiliation. They expected him to rebuild the army, wait for the opportune moment, and then lead a glorious crusade east to reclaim their lost province from the claws of the Russian bear. This was the emotional core of his mandate. The revanchist party in Sweden, a powerful coalition of officers and nobles, saw him as their chosen instrument of vengeance. They weren't just expecting it. They were demanding it. Restoring Sweden to its former glory meant one thing and one thing only: getting Finland back. Karl Johan, however, was not a man ruled by sentiment. He was a product of 20 years of brutal, pragmatic warfare. He looked at the Finland situation not as a romantic quest to restore a lost golden age, but as a cold, hard strategic problem. He sat down with the maps, the census data, and the military readiness reports, and he did the math. And the conclusion he came to was stark, logical, and destined to be wildly unpopular. The plan to retake Finland was a terrible business model. First, he analyzed the military reality. Russia was a geopolitical monster with a seemingly endless supply of manpower. Sweden, by contrast, was a nation of barely 3 million people, even with the reforms he was implementing. The Swedish army would always be hopelessly outnumbered. A war for Finland would be a bloody, grinding affair against a superior foe. And as a general who had served in the Grande Armée, he had a healthy respect for what happened to armies that got bogged down fighting on Russia's doorstep. It was a high-risk gamble with a low probability of a decisive, lasting victory. Second, there was the geographic nightmare. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that Sweden managed to win. By some miracle, they pushed the Russians out and reclaimed Helsinki. What then? Finland shares a 1,000-kilometer land border with Russia. It's geographically indefensible for a power based in Stockholm. Holding it would mean turning Sweden into a permanent garrison state, forever bleeding men and money to defend an eastern frontier against an enormous, resentful neighbor who would never, ever accept the loss. The reconquest of Finland wouldn't end the conflict with Russia. It would make it a permanent, unwinnable feature of Swedish life. Third, he looked at the books. The country was just starting to climb out of bankruptcy. A full-scale war of revenge would be ruinously expensive. It would undo all his financial reforms and plunge the nation back into debt and despair. All for a piece of territory that, from a purely strategic perspective, was now more of a liability than an asset. The cost-benefit analysis was horrifically clear. The price of a war for Finland was certain bankruptcy, and the prize was a territory that would be impossible to hold. It was a sentimental vanity project that the company, Sweden AB, simply could not afford. This cold, dispassionate analysis led him to a radical and heretical conclusion. Cause, as Sweden's new leader, Karl Johan is immediately confronted with the powerful national expectation that he will launch a war of revenge to reconquer Finland from Russia. Effect, he applies his ruthless military and political pragmatism to the problem, analyzing the strategic, geographic, and economic realities, and concludes that a war for Finland is militarily reckless, geographically untenable, and financially catastrophic. Consequence, he makes the secret and politically explosive decision to completely abandon the centuries-old Finland policy. He accepts the loss as permanent, a radical strategic pivot that would inevitably set him against the very people who had brought him to power. This was the moment the hired gun told the client that their grand vision was a sentimental fantasy that would drive them off a cliff. The Swedes had hired him to win them a specific war, and his first major strategic decision was that the war itself was a fundamentally stupid idea. This decision shows that Karl Johan's loyalty wasn't to Sweden's past, but to its future. He wasn't interested in reclaiming lost glory. He was interested in survival and stability. He was a forward-looking strategist, not a romantic nationalist. He knew he couldn't just announce this to the Swedish people. By the way, that thing you care about more than anything else, we're not doing it. That would be political suicide. If he was going to take Finland off the table, he needed to offer them something else, something better. So, Karl Johan had made his first major executive decision. The national obsession with retaking Finland D was a one-way ticket to bankruptcy and ruin. The project was cancelled. But a leader can't just take away a nation as dearest hope without offering something in its place. You can't just tell a jilted lover to get over it. You have to show them a better future. Karl Johan knew he needed a new grand prize, a new strategic objective that was shinier, more attainable, and ultimately more valuable than the one he had just secretly thrown in the trash. He needed a pivot. Spreading the map of Northern Europe out on his desk, he looked at Sweden's predicament. The path east, towards Finland, was a dead end guarded by the Russian bear. So, he looked west. And there, sharing the massive Scandinavian peninsula, was Norway. For over 400 years, Norway had been ruled by Denmark. It was the jewel in the Danish crown, and Denmark, crucially, was a loyal, almost slavish, ally of Napoleon Bonaparte. The gears in Karl Johan's mind began to turn, and a new, breathtakingly audacious plan began to form. What if, instead of bleeding Sweden dry in an unwinnable war against Russia for Finland, he compensated Sweden by taking Norway from Denmark? This was not just a substitute, it was an upgrade. From a purely strategic standpoint, the Norway plan was infinitely superior to the Finland plan. First, there was the simple, brutal military math. Denmark was not Russia. Denmark was a second-rate power, and its navy had been shattered by the British years earlier. A war against Denmark for control of Norway was a war that Sweden could actually win. It was a calculated, manageable risk, not a suicidal charge. Second, the geographic logic was flawless. By losing Finland, Sweden had lost its eastern buffer. But by gaining Norway, it could create something far more valuable, a unified, defensible Scandinavian peninsula. A Sweden-Norway union would be a geopolitical fortress. Bordered by the Baltic Sea, the North Sea, and the Atlantic Ocean, it would consolidate Sweden's power, secure its western flank, and create a single, cohesive kingdom. It was a nation-builder's dream. Third, the economics were compelling. Norway possessed a massive merchant fleet, deep ties to Atlantic trade, and rich natural resources. Acquiring it would be a huge economic boon, transforming Sweden into a true maritime power. Finland offered sentimental value, Norway offered cold, hard cash and strategic depth. But the true genius of the Norway plan was the diplomatic judo move it allowed. The old policy reclaiming Finland made Russia Sweden's permanent and mortal enemy. The new policy inverted everything. By targeting Norway, an asset belonging to a French ally, Karl Johan could turn all of Napoleon's enemies into Sweden's potential friends. This was the great pivot. The logic was as cynical as it was brilliant. Step 1. Approach Russia. Tell the Tsar, we officially and forever renounce our claim to Finland. It's yours. We accept the border of 1809. This single move would erase the primary source of conflict between the two nations. Step 2. With that out of the way, ask the Tsar for a favor. In exchange for us giving up Finland and guaranteeing peace on your northern border, would you support our claim to Norway? After all, it belongs to Denmark, which is your enemy Napoleon's ally. Step 3. Make the same pitch to Great Britain. We're currently in a phony war with you that we hate. Help us get Norway from Napoleon's Danish puppet, and we will become your firm ally in the north. It was a complete reversal of a century of foreign policy. Cause, having secretly abandoned the goal of reconquering Finland, Karl Johan requires a new, compelling national objective that is both strategically sound and politically palatable. Effect, he shifts his focus from east to west and conceives a radical new grand strategy to compensate for the loss of Finland by conquering Norway, which is currently ruled by Napoleon's ally, Denmark. Consequence, this Norway plan completely upends Sweden's traditional foreign policy, proposing to abandon the rivalry with Russia in favor of a potential alliance with Russia and Great Britain. Aimed squarely against Denmark and the Napoleonic system, you have to admire the sheer cold-blooded realpolitik of it all. This was Karl Johan, the ultimate unsentimental strategist, telling his new country, stop obsessing over your ex, Finland. The relationship was going nowhere. I've found you a new partner, Norway. It's a much better match and will make you stronger and richer. He was proposing to trade a historic enemy for a historic rival, to swap a lost cause for a winnable prize. He was redrawing the mental map of Sweden, turning its gaze away from the east and toward a new, united Scandinavian future. The plan was brilliant. It was logical. It was also a massive political gamble that would require him to betray his origins and forge an alliance with his country's oldest and most hated foe. The Norway plan was a work of cold, strategic genius. It was also a political suicide mission. The entire plan depended on one single, unthinkable prerequisite: making an alliance with Russia. For Sweden, Russia was not just a rival, it was the hereditary enemy, the national boogeyman. It was the rapacious empire that had been tearing pieces off the Swedish kingdom for over a century, culminating in the traumatic theft of Finland. The Swedish army was practically founded on the principle of hating Russia, suggesting a military alliance with the Tsar in Stockholm was like suggesting a tofu barbecue in Texas. It was unnatural, offensive, and violated every cherished tradition. But Karl Johan was not a man who cared for tradition when it got in the way of results. He knew that Tsar Alexander I was the key that unlocked the entire puzzle, and so he began one of the most delicate and audacious diplomatic dances of the 19th century. He set out to seduce the Tsar. This couldn't be done through official channels. The Swedish government was still full of revanchists who would have had a collective aneurysm if they knew what he was up to. So, Karl Johan went into spy mode. He used secret envoys, trusted back-channel contacts, and discreet letters to open a line of communication directly to the court in St. Petersburg. His mission: to convince his country's most hated enemy to become its new best friend. The pitch he made to Alexander was a masterstroke of realpolitik. It was a grand bargain, presented with the clarity of a business proposal. First, he offered Alexander the one thing the Tsar wanted more than anything else from Sweden: security. He laid his most valuable card on the table. Immediately, Your Majesty, the message went, Sweden is prepared to do the unthinkable. We will formally and in perpetuity renounce all claims to the Grand Duchy of Finland. The border of 1809 will be accepted as the final, legitimate frontier between our nations. The Finland question, the eternal source of our conflict, will be closed forever. This was a diplomatic earthquake. He was offering to give away the very thing he had been hired to get back. But it was the necessary sacrifice to get the Tsar's attention. With that stunning concession made, he moved to phase 2, the ask. In return for this guarantee of permanent peace on your northern flank, he proposed, we request Russia's full support for our own compensation. We intend to acquire Norway. As you know, Norway belongs to the King of Denmark. And the King of Denmark is the loyal servant of your enemy, Napoleon Bonaparte. Finally, he zoomed out to the big picture, framing it not as a grubby land swap, but as the foundation of a noble new alliance. An alliance between Sweden and Russia, brought into a partnership with Great Britain, would create an unbreakable northern front against French aggression. A Sweden strengthened by a union with Norway would be a far more powerful and reliable ally for Russia. He was inviting the Tsar to co-author a new security arrangement for Northern Europe, one that was explicitly anti-Napoleonic. From his palace in St. Petersburg, Tsar Alexander I looked at this proposal, and he must have been stunned by its sheer, brilliant cynicism. Why would he even consider it? Because by 1811, Alexander knew that his fragile alliance with Napoleon was about to explode into the largest war the world had ever seen. He was desperately gathering allies for the coming apocalypse, and this offer from Sweden was a godsend. The promise to secure his northern border was immensely valuable. It meant he wouldn't have to station tens of thousands of troops to guard St. Petersburg from a potential Swedish attack. He could move those forces south to face Napoleon's main invasion. And the idea of flipping a French Marshal, the propaganda value alone was incalculable. It was a sign that Napoleon's own system was cracking from within. Karl Johan, the insider, the man who knew Napoleon's methods, was offering to join his side. It was a massive strategic and psychological coup. The logic was undeniable, leading to a stunning diplomatic breakthrough. In order to execute his ambitious Norway plan, Karl Johan initiates a secret diplomatic negotiation with Tsar Alexander I, the leader of Sweden's most hated enemy. He presents the Tsar with an unprecedented grand bargain. Sweden will permanently give up its claim to Finland in exchange for Russia's backing for the Swedish annexation of Norway from Napoleon's ally, Denmark. Consequence, Tsar Alexander, recognizing the huge strategic benefit of securing his northern border right before his impending war with Napoleon, becomes highly receptive to the deal, paving the way for a historic reversal of alliances that would turn the two mortal enemies into partners. This was statesmanship of the highest order. Karl Johan was asking both his own people and the Tsar to discard centuries of hatred, paranoia, and bad blood in favor of a clear-eyed assessment of their mutual interests. He was proving that in the great game of nations, there are no permanent enemies or permanent friends, only permanent interests. The seduction was working. The two old foes were talking, and Napoleon, the master manipulator, was about to be outmaneuvered by his own former subordinate. By 1812, the phony peace between France and Russia was over. On the plains of Poland, Napoleon Bonaparte was gathering the Grande Armée, a terrifying multinational force of over 500,000 men, for what he believed would be his masterstroke, the invasion and subjugation of Russia. This was the group project to end all group projects, and the emperor was demanding that every nation in his sphere of influence contribute. He turned his eyes north to Sweden, fully expecting his former Marshal, Crown Prince Karl Johan, to finally drop the charade with Britain and fall in line. The time for games was over. He needed Sweden's armies, and he needed them now. The demands arrived in Stockholm like a set of commandments. Sweden was to formally ally with France against Russia. Sweden was to contribute a corps of troops to the invasion force. And Sweden was to finally, truly, enforce the continental system, crushing all illicit trade with Great Britain to show he was serious. Napoleon made a move of stunning arrogance and spectacular stupidity. In January 1812, claiming he needed to stop the smuggling, he ordered his troops to invade and occupy Swedish Pomerania, Sweden's last little foothold in Germany. It was a bully's punch, a classic piece of Napoleonic intimidation designed to scare the Swedes into obedience. He could not have miscalculated more disastrously. The invasion of Pomerania was the single greatest gift Napoleon could have given Karl Johan. Until that moment, Karl Johan's secret anti-French plotting was a risky, backroom affair. Now, Napoleon had just given him the perfect casus belli. This unprovoked act of aggression against Swedish territory outraged the Swedish public and politicians. Suddenly, an alliance with Russia against France wasn't some cynical, unnatural pact. It was a justified war of national defense. Napoleon had single-handedly made Karl Johann's secret policy the popular and patriotic choice, with the wind now firmly at his back. Karl Johann received Napoleon's formal demands for an alliance. He had been secretly negotiating with Tsar Alexander for almost a year. He was ready. He did not simply refuse Napoleon. That would have been too simple. Instead, he responded with a counter-offer so audacious, so dripping with passive-aggressive genius, that it must have sent the emperor into a fit of apoplectic rage. The letter he sent back was a masterpiece of diplomatic trolling. It read something to the effect of, "Your Imperial Majesty, your most loyal servant is, of course, ready to ally with you. I will personally lead 35,000 elite Swedish troops to fight your enemies in Germany. My loyalty is beyond question. I have but two small conditions. First, before I march, you must approve and assist me in my conquest of Norway. Second, you must pay for the entire expedition, including the salaries for all my troops. P.S. Please get out of Pomerania." This was an offer designed to be rejected. He was asking Napoleon to betray his loyal ally, Denmark, and hand over their most valuable territory, all while footing the bill for the privilege. It was a polite, formal, exquisitely crafted get lost. He was using Napoleon's own transactional language against him, turning the negotiation into a farce. Napoleon, of course, rejected it furiously, and after that, Karl Johann simply left him on read. This was the final, definitive break, as he finalizes his plans for the invasion of Russia, Napoleon demands Sweden's full military support and invades Swedish Pomerania to intimidate them into compliance. Effect: the unprovoked invasion backfires completely, giving Karl Johann the popular support he needs to openly defy France. He responds to Napoleon's demands with a deliberately impossible counteroffer, which is angrily rejected. Consequence: having formally rebuffed Napoleon, Karl Johann finalizes his secret alliance with Russia, leaving the French emperor to launch the largest invasion in human history, with the newly hostile Sweden threatening his crucial northern flank. Imagine the scene. June 1812, Napoleon stands at the Niemen River, watching his 500,000 soldiers march into Russia, heading for what he thinks will be his greatest victory. But in the back of his mind, he has to know he's been played. The man he had personally allowed to take the Swedish throne, his own former Marshal, had not only refused to join the group project, but had secretly teamed up with the competition. It was the ultimate betrayal, hatched under his own nose and enabled by his own arrogance. The greatest military gamble in history was about to begin, and thanks to Karl Johann, the odds had just gotten significantly worse. Napoleon was marching into the heart of Russia, confident that the sheer size of his army would crush all resistance. He was focused on the road to Moscow. What he failed to appreciate was the diplomatic earthquake happening on his northern flank. Karl Johann hadn't just ghosted him. He was now formalizing his relationship with Napoleon's primary target. The secret seduction of the Tsar was about to become a very public marriage of convenience. With the Grande Armée pouring across the Russian border in the summer of 1812, the time for secret letters and back-channel envoys was over. Tsar Alexander I and Crown Prince Karl Johann needed to meet face-to-face to cement their alliance. A top-secret summit was arranged, and the location they chose was a masterstroke of political symbolism, the city of Bibio, known today as Turku in Finland. Let the irony of that sink in. The leaders of Sweden and Russia were meeting to sign a treaty of friendship and alliance in the capital of the very province that had been the source of their endless, bloody conflict. By agreeing to meet there, Karl Johann was making the most powerful statement imaginable. He was stepping onto Finnish soil, not as a conqueror or a claimant, but as a visitor. He was visually and politically demonstrating that he had, in fact, let Finland go. It was a gesture of immense trust building before a single word of the treaty was signed. The meeting itself was a fascinating encounter between two of the era's most complex figures. On one side was Tsar Alexander I, the enigmatic, mystical, and deeply shrewd ruler of Russia, now facing the fight of his life against Napoleon's invasion. On the other was Karl Johann, the pragmatic, ambitious, self-made ex-marshal, a man who knew his enemy's playbook better than anyone. They were two very different men, brought together by a shared, existential threat. They hit it off immediately. They spent hours in deep conversation. The French-speaking Swedish crown prince and the French-speaking Russian Tsar, Karl Johann, the ultimate insider, gave Alexander an invaluable psychological and strategic profile of Napoleon. He broke down the emperor's methods, his vanities, his weaknesses. He gave his assessment of the other French marshals, their strengths and their rivalries. For Alexander, this was intelligence gold, a priceless glimpse into the mind of the man who was currently burning his way across Russia, a deep personal and strategic bond was forged. The negotiations were swift. The grand bargain had already been hammered out in secret. The Treaty of Bibiaux, signed in August 1812, simply made it official. The terms were clean and revolutionary. First, Russia formally guaranteed that it would support Sweden in acquiring Norway from Denmark, either through diplomacy or by force. Second, Sweden, in return, formally and forever recognized Russia's sovereignty over Finland. The Great Wound was officially closed. Third, they agreed on military cooperation. Sweden would prepare an army to land in Germany and harass Napoleon's northern front. But Karl Johan made it crystal clear this would happen only after he had secured Norway. Norway was the price for his entry into the war. Finally, they agreed to bring Great Britain into their new northern coalition, with the British providing the naval support and, crucially, the money to fund the whole enterprise. The signing of this treaty marked a complete reversal of the strategic landscape, with Napoleon's invasion of Russia making their secret cooperation a matter of extreme urgency. Karl Johan and Tsar Alexander I arrange a historic face-to-face summit in the symbolic city of Bibiaux, Finland. In effect, the two leaders forge a strong personal and political alliance. Formalizing their grand bargain in the Treaty of Bibiaux, Russia will help Sweden get Norway, and Sweden will permanently renounce its claim to Finland. Consequence, this treaty officially turns Sweden from a cowed neutral power into a declared, an active enemy of the French Empire, creating a formal northern front, and completing one of the most stunning diplomatic reversals of the entire Napoleonic era. This meeting was the ultimate enemy of my enemy is my friend moment. The treaty was signed on the symbolic grave of their centuries-long rivalry. It was a testament to Karl Johan's cold-eyed pragmatism. He had successfully convinced his country's oldest foe that their mutual interest in defeating Napoleon was more important than their mutual history of hating each other, while the Grande Armée was marching towards Borodino. A new, powerful alliance was being born in its rear. The ink was dry, the deal was done. Sweden was now officially at war with the nation its crown prince had once served. The betrayal was complete. The ink on the Treaty of Bibiaux was more than just a diplomatic agreement. It was the punchline to one of history's greatest geopolitical jokes. Let's take a moment to rewind and appreciate the spectacular, weapons grade irony of what had just happened. Why was Jean Bernadotte, now Karl Johan, hired in the first place? He was brought to Sweden for one reason above all others. He was a world-class French general, a product of Napoleon's war machine, who was supposed to use his modern military genius to lead Sweden in a glorious war of revenge against Russia to reclaim Finland. He was, in essence, the ultimate anti-Russian weapon, purchased at great political expense. And what did this weapon do? Upon being unpacked, it immediately turned around, walked over to the intended target, and gave it a firm, friendly handshake. Karl Johan, the man hired to fight Russia, had just signed a treaty of eternal friendship with Russia. The man hired to reclaim Finland had just formally signed Finland away forever. And the man hired for his French military credentials was now officially allied with Russia, in a coalition whose sole purpose was to destroy the French Empire. This wasn't just a change of plans. This was the ultimate uno reverse card. The Swedish government had played their hire a French general card, expecting the game to proceed in a certain direction. But Karl Johan had just looked at their card, smirked, and slapped down a draw for a skip and a reverse all at once, completely changing the color of the game and the entire direction of play. He didn't just switch teams, he had fundamentally re-engineered the game itself to suit his own strategy. From Napoleon's perspective, deep in the smoldering plains of Russia, this was an act of unforgivable treason. This was not just a political betrayal, it was a personal one. One of his own marshals, his brother-in-law, a man whom he had personally enriched and elevated to the rank of prince, had not just abandoned him, but had actively joined the enemy during the most critical campaign of his life. To Napoleon, this was desertion in the face of the enemy, a stab in the back of the highest order. His fury was immense. He had expected a pawn, he had gotten a viper. But from Karl Johan's perspective, this was not treason. It was the ultimate act of patriotism for his new country. When he became crown prince, he had sworn an oath to Sweden. His loyalty, he argued, was to the Swedish people, not to the French emperor who had repeatedly humiliated him and had just invaded Swedish territory without provocation. He was simply doing his job, securing the best possible future for Sweden, and if that meant allying with the devil himself to escape the clutches of a tyrant, then so be it. He was the CEO of Sweden AB, and this was a brutal but necessary business decision. For the Swedes themselves, it was a moment of profound whiplash. The warhawks who dreamed of retaking Finland were apoplectic. This was a betrayal of the national cause. But a growing number of realists, watching Napoleon's megalomania drag the continent into endless war, saw the cold, hard genius in their new leader's plan. He had neutralized their most powerful enemy and was offering them a more valuable, more defensible, and more attainable prize in Norway. He wasn't delivering the sentimental revenge they thought they wanted, but he was delivering something much better, a viable strategy for survival and prosperity. The final, brutal logic of this reversal was now locked in place. Carl Johan formalizes his secret negotiations by signing the Treaty of Bibio, committing Sweden to a military alliance with Russia. Effect: this act represents the complete and total inversion of his original mandate, as the French Marshal hired specifically to fight Russia has now officially joined forces with Russia to wage war against his native France. Consequence: the betrayal infuriates Napoleon and provides a massive strategic and morale boost to the forming Sixth Coalition, transforming Sweden from a potential French puppet into a crucial player in the eventual downfall of the French Empire. The stage was now set for the final, bloody act of the Napoleonic Wars. The teams were chosen, and Sweden, under the leadership of its new French crown prince, had officially joined the coalition dedicated to the destruction of France. Carl Johan, the ultimate poacher, had not just turned gamekeeper, he was now actively leading the hunt against his former colleagues. The ultimate Uno reverse card had been played, and it was Napoleon's turn to draw. The Russian winter of 1812 did what no European army had ever managed to do. It broke the Grande Armée. Napoleon limped back to Paris, having lost 500,000 men in the catastrophic campaign. This was the moment his enemies had been praying for. The scent of blood was in the water. Prussia, seeing its chance, broke its coerced alliance with France and joined Russia. Great Britain, the eternal bankroller of anti-Napoleonic coalitions, opened the treasury. The Sixth Coalition was born, and its goal was not just to defeat Napoleon, but to finish him. And a key, eagerly awaited member of this new alliance was Sweden, led by its crown prince, Carl Johan. His moment had come. After finalizing a treaty with Britain that secured a massive subsidy of £1 million to fund his war effort, Carl Johan landed his army of 30,000 Swedes in Pomerania, the very province Napoleon had so foolishly seized. He was back on the continent, a sovereign prince at the head of his own army, ready to claim his pound of flesh, which he very much hoped would be shaped like the Kingdom of Norway. The Allies now faced a critical decision. They were assembling a massive force in northern Germany, a multinational army of Swedes, Russians, Prussians, and a smattering of German defectors. But who could possibly lead such a politically fractious and linguistically diverse force? The Russians didn't want to serve under a Prussian, and the Prussians didn't trust the Russians. They needed a commander who was both respected and, in a strange way, neutral. And all eyes turned to the new guy. In a moment of historical irony so thick you could cut it with a cavalry saber, the command of the Allied Army of the North was given to Crown Prince Carl Johan of Sweden, formerly known as Jean Bernadotte, Marshal of France. The logic was as bizarre as it was undeniable. Who knew how to beat Napoleon better than one of his own superstar generals? Who understood the French system of war, the psychology of its commanders, the strengths and weaknesses of its tactics? He was the ultimate insider, the man who had the enemy's playbook memorized. He was the poacher who had just been made head gamekeeper. And the first thing he did was help write a new set of rules for the hunt. Along with the other Allied commanders, he co-authored the Trachenberg Plan, the master strategy for the 1813 campaign. It was a strategy born of a deep and abiding respect for Napoleon's genius. The core principle was brutally simple: do not, under any circumstances, fight a major battle against Napoleon himself. Napoleon was a tactical demigod, the greatest battlefield commander of his age. Seeking a decisive battle with him was what he wanted. It was playing his game. The Trachenberg Plan was designed to refuse that game. The Allied armies would operate in concert. If Napoleon moved with his main army to attack one of them, that army would retreat, refusing battle. Meanwhile, the other Allied armies would advance, attacking his flanks, his supply lines, and, most importantly, his subordinates. The goal was to only engage the forces led by his other marshals. The plan was to bleed Napoleon's army dry, pick off his lieutenants one by one, and only converge for a final, massive battle when the Allies had overwhelming numerical superiority. It was a strategy of attrition, of caution, of a boa constrictor slowly squeezing its prey. In the wake of Napoleon's disastrous Russian campaign, the Sixth Coalition forms, and Crown Prince Carl Johan brings his Swedish army to Germany to join the fight against France. Effect: in a stunning turn of events, the Allies appoint the former French Marshal to command their multinational army of the North and adopt the Trachenberg Plan, a strategy he helped devise, which focuses on avoiding Napoleon himself while systematically defeating his subordinates. Consequence: as commander of a vast allied army, Karl Johann successfully executes this strategy, engaging and defeating the French Marshal sent against him, thereby protecting Berlin, wearing down Napoleon's forces, and proving his immense value to the very coalition he was originally hired to fight. Leading his army of 150,000 men, Karl Johann now faced his former comrades across the battlefield. When Napoleon sent Marshal Oudinot to capture Berlin, Karl Johann's army met and defeated him. When Napoleon, furious, sent the legendary Marshal Ney to try again, Karl Johann's forces defeated him. As well, he was flawlessly executing the plan, fighting his old friends and colleagues, and winning. This was the ultimate betrayal, weaponized into a brilliant military strategy. The Allies hadn't just gained an army, they had gained a priceless intelligence asset. They had the man who knew all the secret audibles and all the plays. Karl Johann was not trying to outfight Napoleon, he was outthinking him, refusing to play by the emperor's rules. And as the summer of 1813 wore on, the strategy was working. Napoleon was getting bogged down, his forces were being whittled away, and his marshals were losing their aura of invincibility. The stage was being set for a final, decisive showdown. The Allied strategy of attrition, the Trachenberg Plan, had worked to perfection. By avoiding Napoleon and picking off his marshals, the armies of the Sixth Coalition had worn the French emperor down. By the autumn of 1813, they had finally achieved what they needed: overwhelming numerical superiority. They converged their three massive armies, the Austrians and Russians from the south, the Prussians from the east, and Karl Johann's multinational army of the north on a single point on the map, the German city of Leipzig. The result was the Battle of the Nations, the single largest and bloodiest battle of the entire Napoleonic Wars. For 3 days in October, over 500,000 men were locked in a titanic struggle. This was the decisive showdown, the final exam for the coalition, and Karl Johann's role in it was, to put it mildly, controversial. He and his army were there, on the northern flank, but he was notoriously slow to commit his troops to the main slaughterhouse. His allies, the Prussians and Russians, who were taking horrific casualties in the main fighting, were furious. They accused him of cowardice, of shirking his duty, but Karl Johann was not a coward. He was a ruthless pragmatist. He was playing a different game than everyone else. For the Tsar and the King of Prussia, Leipzig was a battle for the liberation of Germany. For Karl Johann, Leipzig was a dangerous business meeting he was contractually obligated to attend before he could go close the real estate deal he actually cared about. His primary objective had never been the destruction of the French army. It was the acquisition of Norway. Every Swedish soldier who died in the mud of Leipzig was one less soldier he would have for his real war against Denmark. So, he did the bare minimum. He held his flank, contributed some artillery, and let his allies do most of the dying. It was a cold, cynical, and brutally effective move. The battle was a resounding, catastrophic defeat for Napoleon. His army was shattered, his German allies defected in the middle of the fight, and he was sent reeling in a disastrous retreat back to France. The war for Germany was over, as the main Allied armies prepared for the final push, the invasion of France itself to dethrone the emperor. Karl Johann announced he had other plans. He had fulfilled his treaty obligations. He had helped defeat Napoleon in Germany. Now it was time to collect his paycheck. While the rest of the coalition turned southwest towards Paris, Karl Johann wheeled his entire army of the north and marched north. His target was Denmark. The campaign was a foregone conclusion. The Danish army was no match for Karl Johann's massive, battle-hardened, multinational force. In a lightning winter campaign, he smashed all resistance. Denmark, facing total annihilation, quickly surrendered in January 1814, with the war against Napoleon still raging in France. Karl Johann sat down with the Danes and dictated the terms of peace. The result was the Treaty of Kiel, the triumphant culmination of his entire grand strategy. Cause, after the Allied armies, including Karl Johann's Army of the North, corner and decisively defeat Napoleon at the titanic Battle of Leipzig, the war for Germany is won. Effect: Karl Johann immediately pivots, ignoring the Allied campaign into France and instead marching his largely preserved army north to launch a swift and overwhelming invasion of Denmark. Consequence: the Danes are quickly crushed and forced to sign the Treaty of Kiel, which officially cedes the entire Kingdom of Norway to Sweden, fulfilling the grand strategic bargain. Karl Johann had been masterfully engineering for the past 2 years. It was one of the most brilliant and cynical manipulations in diplomatic history. Karl Johann had effectively used a world war as a vehicle for a regional land grab. He had leveraged the existential crisis of the great powers of Europe, Prussia, and Great Britain, and used their immense military might as his personal sledgehammer to smash Denmark and achieve a purely Swedish strategic objective. He had shown up to the party, made a brief appearance, and walked out with the one thing he had come for. Napoleon was not yet defeated. He would be exiled to Elba a few months later. But Karl Johann already had his prize, the Norway Plan. The great pivot that had seemed so radical and risky had been a spectacular, unqualified success. Karl Johann had his prize. The Treaty of Kiel had legally transferred Norway to Sweden. But there was one small, inconvenient party that hadn't been consulted: the Norwegians. Fueled by the rising tide of 19th century nationalism, the people of Norway were not particularly thrilled about being passed from one foreign ruler to another like a deed of property. They had no interest in swapping the king in Copenhagen for a king in Stockholm. So they did what any self-respecting nation would do. They declared independence, drafted one of Europe's most liberal constitutions, and elected their own king. For Karl Johann, this was an infuriating administrative headache. He had not just outmaneuvered Napoleon and rearranged the map of Europe to get Norway, only to have it declare a principled objection at the last minute. So, in the summer of 1814, after Napoleon's first abdication freed up his attention, Karl Johann led his battle-hardened Swedish army on one last mission. The ensuing war with Norway was short, sharp, and decisive. The Norwegian independence fighters were brave but hopelessly outmatched. But here, Karl Johann showed that he was more than just a general. He was a statesman. Instead of crushing the Norwegians and imposing a harsh rule, he offered them an incredibly generous peace. He agreed to accept their new constitution as the law of the land in Norway. He agreed that Norway would not be a Swedish province, but an equal partner in a personal union, with its own parliament and laws. They would share a king, but they would be two distinct kingdoms. It was a brilliant move. It pacified the Norwegians, secured the union, and laid the foundation for a century of mostly peaceful coexistence. The final piece of his grand plan was now in place. With the wars over and the union secured, he returned to Stockholm to wait. He was the ruler of Sweden and Norway in all but name, the powerful region for the now completely senile King Charles XIII. For 4 years, he governed, consolidating his power, stabilizing the economy, and transitioning from a wartime commander to a peacetime administrator. He became, ironically for a man of the French Revolution, an increasingly conservative force, a firm believer in stability and the established order. Then, in February 1818, the old king finally died. The long wait was over. At the age of 55, the son of a French lawyer from Pau, Jean Bernadotte, was crowned King of Sweden and King of Norway. He took the name Charles XIV John in Sweden and Charles III John in Norway. The former Marshal of France, the former Prince of Pontecorvo, the revolutionary soldier, was now a legitimate, anointed, hereditary monarch. His improbable journey had reached its destination. The House of Bernadotte had officially begun. He would go on to have a long and, by all accounts, successful reign, ruling until his death in 1844. He brought Sweden the things it desperately needed: peace and stability. After centuries of constant, ruinous warfare, he established a new foreign policy of neutrality that would become Sweden's defining feature. He was a good king. He was a strong king. But there was one thing he never, ever became: a Swede. Cause, after successfully securing Norway and ruling for years as the powerful Crown Prince Regent, Karl Johann must wait for the elderly king, Charles XIII, to pass away. Effect, in 1818, he is finally crowned King Charles XIV John, formally ascending the throne and securing the future of the new royal house he has founded, the House of Bernadotte. Consequence, despite a long, peaceful, and prosperous reign, he never manages to learn the Swedish language, forever marking him as a foreigner in his own kingdom and creating the enduring paradox of a hugely successful dynasty founded by a man who could barely speak to his subjects. In all his 26 years on the throne, he never mastered Swedish. He conducted the entirety of his government's business in French. His ministers had to act as his permanent translators. This created a strange and eternal distance between the king and his people. He was respected, even admired for his competence, but he was never embraced with the warmth reserved for a native son. He was, to the very end, the brilliant French general they had hired for a job. It's the final, beautiful irony of his rebranding campaign. He had changed his name, his religion, his citizenship, and his lifelong allegiance, he had redrawn the map of his new country and founded a royal dynasty that, astonishingly, still rules Sweden to this day. He managed to transform everything about himself except the words that came out of his mouth. He was a stranger who had become a king, a magnificent, successful, and eternally foreign father of his country. The man on the throne of Sweden was a living paradox. King Charles XIV John, the founder of a new royal house, was a man whose entire life was a testament to the revolutionary idea that a commoner of talent could rise to the greatest heights. And yet, once he reached that height, his primary political goal was to make sure no one else could ever follow his path. The revolutionary spent the rest of his life trying to bolt the door against revolution. As king, the former Jacobin became a pillar of the post-Napoleonic conservative order. This was the era of the Concert of Europe, a system designed by arch-conservatives like Austria's Prince Metternich to ruthlessly suppress the dangerous ideas of liberalism, nationalism, and democracy, the very ideas that had fueled Bernadotte's own rise. He had joined the club of kings, and he eagerly adopted their reactionary playbook. At home in Sweden, he was a firm, authoritarian ruler. He resisted calls for constitutional reform, censored the press when it criticized him, and viewed the rising liberal movement with deep suspicion. The man who had once fought for liberty, equality, fraternity now stood for order, tradition, and heredity. He had climbed the ladder to the top, and then promptly kicked it away. His entire contradictory existence is perfectly encapsulated in one final, magnificent anecdote. It is the story of his death in March 1844, after a long and peaceful reign of 26 years. The old king died in his bed at the age of 81, as his physicians attended to the body of the deceased monarch. They are said to have discovered something astonishing. There, on the skin of the king, was a faded, blurry tattoo from his fiery youth as a soldier in the French Revolution. The tattoo allegedly read, "Mort aux rois," death to kings. Whether the story is literally true or a legend that was simply too perfect to not be told, it is the ultimate punchline. The physical body of this legitimate, long-reigning, deeply conservative king was permanently marked with a call for his own destruction. It was the final, secret evidence of the man he had once been, a man he had spent half his life becoming and the other half trying to forget. It was the ultimate testament to the most successful rebranding in history, a rebranding so total that it had managed to conceal the revolutionary slogan literally written on the king's own flesh. This contradiction is his ultimate legacy, cause the former revolutionary Jean Bernadotte, having achieved the ultimate position of power as a hereditary monarch, dedicated his reign to protecting his throne and his new dynasty from the very forces of change that had enabled his own improbable rise, effect, as King Charles XIV John. He governed as a staunch conservative, opposing liberal reforms at home and aligning Sweden with the reactionary powers of post-Napoleonic Europe. Consequence, his legacy is a profound paradox. A revolutionary who became a reactionary, a king allegedly bearing a death to king's tattoo, and a French commoner who successfully founded a stable, peaceful, and enduring Swedish royal dynasty that reigns to this very day. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a villain. He was the consummate political survivor, a man of immense talent and even greater ambition. He was a pragmatist who surfed the most chaotic decades in European history and managed to end up on top, securing a crown for himself and, against all odds, a long and prosperous peace for his adopted nation. The House of Bernadotte, born of a rogue mission, a series of diplomatic betrayals, and the towering ambition of one French Marshal, still sits on the throne of Sweden. The rebranding, against all logic, works suspiciously well. And that's the frankly insane story of how Sweden hired a French general to be its king. He was hired to fight Russia, but instead made friends with Russia. He was hired because he was French, and then immediately joined a war to crush France. He was a revolutionary who became a deeply conservative king. The whole thing was a glorious, chaotic, and ultimately successful mess that just proves history has a much better sense of humor than any of us now. A quick reminder, please do not cite this podcast in your term papers. Your history professor will cry. We are here for the fun, not the footnotes. But if you had fun and you want to hear more stories about bizarre historical decisions, let us know in the comments what we should cover next. We're always looking for new tales of inexplicable choices and unintended consequences, and that's how that whole mess went down. Until next time, don't invade Russia in the winter.